Hello, and thank you everybody for joining me this evening. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So tonight we are going to be talking about the mad scientists of Atlantis and sort of how this priest class of Atlantis and the dramas within it have this echo in our society today. And we're not really looking in that direction. But if we were to look in that direction and understand, we would really start to see things clearly with a lot of the events that are going on in our world. So before I get started, this is going to be not an exclusive lecture that's just on Gigi Young, but this is going to appear on YouTube. So just to let you guys know, just keep that in mind. And also, when I do your questions at the end of this, I won't be saying your names and I won't be doing shout outs at the end. So if you do have a question, you can just basically do it in the same way. Wolf will take care of all that. And I'll probably run around 3 hours today, maybe a little bit more, because I want to make sure I have a lot of time with your questions. So grab your snacks and let's get going. So why Atlantis? Why does this civilization that seems to be so far in the past have any pull in today? Isn't it long dead and gone? No. Atlantis was an era of humanity. It was an epoch of humanity. And Atlantis is not just a place, a civilization. It embodies a certain consciousness that humanity had, a certain transformation that humanity went through. And so by marking certain civilizations such as Atlantis, such as even Mu, we're not just talking about physical places. We're talking about types of consciousness, stages of development. And this is why if you go into anthroposophy or theosophy, you'll see the epochs being named and given certain developmental status. So it's very important that we understand that these past times are sort of echoes of our own development, and they build upon one another. What was developed in Mu was carried over in Atlantis, and that energy continued to evolve. That consciousness continued to evolve. And then now here we are in the post-Atlantean epoch, and we are still evolving that same consciousness. We're still tossing that ball. So the only way that we can really understand who we are and what this civilization is to understand what it was, to understand what we are becoming. We have to understand what we were. Okay? So no, Atlantis is not just some civilization that we should ignore, that we should pay no attention to because it's happened. Atlantis is something that we have to understand, because the initiation that we faced in Atlantis, we will face again and are facing again right now in just a little bit of a different form. So let's try to understand what happened there and what that form is. So how was Atlantis set up? How was it run? What was it like? Well, Atlantis was ruled by priest kings, actually, something called a priest king. And these priest kings were special in a way. They were conceived in a way that is completely forgotten now because it is part of the feminine mysteries. So these priest kings were different than the leaders that we would see today, the presidents that we would see today, perhaps, or whatever we see as leadership now. This was very different because long ago, these priest kings would have had exalted abilities and powers and exalted wisdom. And they would have had that because they would have been conceived in a very special way. They would have had a holy birth, sometimes called an immaculate conception or parthenogenesis. They would have had a holy birth. And this is deep into the feminine mysteries that we are going to bring this forward today. And that would make it so these priest kings were exalted. And part of their soul was sort of anchored into a higher plane, if you will. Okay, so these priest kings brought in sort of, they would bring in ways to evolve society, ways to heal humanity. And they would sort of take on the problems of society and very directly, and then they would seek to solve it. And this is the original reason why people talk about, divine right and sort of this God-given right to rule. It was because there was literally this little extra juice in there, spiritual juice. Okay. So, these lineages were associated with usually with Venus and the Pleiades, and that's why you'll see those signs and those stars around. So it's not like they were coming, physically from Venus. It was that the spheres would overlap within the human body in certain ways and with the planet and allow exalted births to take place. And there's a whole lineage actually on the planet that is specifically all about allowing this to happen and keeping this tradition and keeping this practice alive. So usually today you can still see this. You can still see this with certain royal families or noble families. You can take a look at their crests, and they may have something, they may associate themselves with certain animals. They may directly claim to be from Venus, like sometimes when you think of Quetzalcoatl, how they say that he came from Venus. Well, this is a way of saying he had a divine birth. Okay. We tend to literalize a lot. We tend to overly materialize and overly externalize occult principles and think that everything is an external thing. Everything means that someone came from another star system, when it's not always the case. So one of the biggest symbols of having a family or a lineage that was associated with a holy birth is the mermaid. And this goes back to Atlantis with Poseidon and Poseidia and the sons of Poseidon and all of that. This is saying, the sons of Venus. This is saying the mer people. This is saying these people were of a divine birth. They are half in the water and half here. They are not fully here. They are not fully there. They are sort of in between. They're kind of like in the twilight in a way, in that they're pulling a lot from another dimension, and that was a symbology for that. Also, a lot of the symbols, like I mentioned, sometimes the bee, sometimes doves on the female side of things. And so there's a whole steganography that is associated with the holy birth cults and the holy birth practices. And by the way, these holy birth practices change depending on the density of the planet. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. There are different forms, and they tend to change according to the density of the planet that we're on. So there was a whole, you could say, lineage of priest kings that were there not to lord over humanity, but to serve humanity in a way that I think that is very hard to understand for us, as we sit literally under some of the most disgusting authoritarian actions that we've seen in a long time. So this is not the same thing, and I want to be very clear about that. This is not a parasitic kind of rulership. This is a service. Okay. So the thing to keep in mind as well is that in Atlantis, people understood a lot more about spirituality, about what I was talking about the divine feminine mysteries and the holy birth cults and all of that. They really understood all this. They knew that there were higher spheres and higher worlds and that they overlapped with our planet. They knew that there were star beings and they would interact with them. Um, they had a protocol for all of their interaction with spirits and higher beings. It was very official. They figured it out, actually. A lot of people think that Atlantis was just this horrible place, but the actual pattern for a lot of the mysteries that people want to know were actually established in Atlantis, and we sort of forgot or distorted or fell from them. Okay. All right. So Atlantis was a high culture during its golden age. It had sophisticated systems of spirituality and life. There was a royal class of priests and priestesses that were in service to mankind. And so I just want to add that why you'll see these sort of higher initiates come into the world is that actually helps to evolve their soul. So you kind of incarnate, sometimes visit directly through stargates or various different means, but the incarnation is very actually key. It's actually the highest form. Visiting physically is not the highest form. Actually being able to incarnate in a certain way is the highest form. And so yeah, I'll just leave it there. But so what they receive when they offer that part of themselves is a higher level of initiation for their soul. So you kind of come down here, you teach what you know, and you take on humanity's pain and trouble. That lightens the load a little bit. You evolve humanity, you offer yourself a little bit, and then that helps to evolve your soul, kind of like a school, if you will. And that's really what we're all going towards, and we're really all trying to do, essentially. That's sort of the pattern of evolution in the cosmos, is to really evolve through service in this way. So if you become a leader and you're not in service to humanity, you're not taking on humanity's troubles and coming up with solutions and leading, then you're not going to evolve. So you can see that we're in a very big inversion of what it should be. Okay. Priest kings that were born through specific rituals and contained intense spiritual wisdom ruled Atlantis, giving the earth the blueprint for what an advanced civilization could be. Because the civilization that they come from initially was kind of a step above where Earth is, if you will. They had regular connection. Atlanteans had regular connections with higher worlds and interdimensional beings. And the civilization was very beautiful until it reached a dark age and began to degrade. Okay. So let's get into why Atlantis began to degrade. Like, what happened? What was the impulse? What made this high civilization fall? So what really set off the shift in Atlantis and really caused it to erode and degrade, it actually wasn't really technology. Not really. That was part of it. That's sort of part of the myth. What really kind of messed Atlantis up was actually a new evolutionary stage was placed upon man, or man was receiving a new spiritual impulse from the cosmos. and had to evolve. And that's actually usually what causes societies to both rise and fall. It's not actually necessarily directly what man does. It's their response to an intensifying of cosmic energy. It's their response to sort of an initiation that the cosmos gives them. So the cosmos will basically always shift, like windows are always opening and closing, and energies are always intensifying, and they hit mankind. And then mankind has to adjust and follow and evolve with the cosmos. You have to evolve with natural law, with natural order. That's why we're here. That's why we go through all of these cycles, is to evolve with it. And so there are these periods where it's kind of like the volume gets turned up, and humanity will have to adjust and evolve and adapt and understand what this adaptation is about, understand how they're being changed. And then they consciously have to shift and change and evolve. And that's called passing an initiation. Okay. So what was the initiation that Atlantis faced? It was the initiation of mind, or of manas. Okay. So basically before that point, Atlanteans sort of functioned in a very, what would be considered a very strange way for us, in that Atlanteans kind of functioned in a naturally psychic way. They were naturally interconnected. They were naturally interconnected. So it's kind of like, humanity was evolving in all of its different phases. If you look at the larger picture, it went through a phase where it was that symbolized by Saturn, and then a phase that was symbolized by the sun, and then kind of a lunar phase. And in all those phases, the human senses were really kind of externalized. They really weren't brought inward. People weren't really individuals. They didn't have a sense of I. They were all kind of interconnected and joined. They were kind of in like a natural psychic hive mind and had natural psychic abilities. They just kind of knew things. And so about halfway through Atlantis, humanity reached a breaking point where it was time to now, that had already been explored and really peaked in Lemuria, which was peak communal living, peak tribal consciousness. So Atlantis comes along, and suddenly people have to be individuals. They have to take everything they learned in the previous phases and now internalize it and become an individual. They have to make their own decisions. They have to figure out who they are, and they can no longer function as this natural tribal consciousness that doesn't really know who they are. And that initiation was introduced in Atlantis. So what was it like? What was it like to live in Atlantis before that mind energy impulse from the cosmos arrived? What was that like? That was a culture of free energy. They had free energy systems. It was kind of utopian in that way. It was very obvious that you were interconnected with humanity. It was very obvious that we were all one in the first phases of Atlantis. And Rudolf Steiner calls this period where humanity was kind of in this natural stage of clairvoyance. They had all of these natural psychic abilities. They didn't really understand how they worked or why they had them. They didn't understand why a bird flew or how a bird flew. They knew these things. And so you see the difference there. There's sort of knowing because you're interconnected with a higher consciousness and you just know, but you don't understand. You haven't internalized that wisdom and broke it down and figured it out, made it part of your life, and you're not an active participant directly. Exactly. And in this earlier phase of Atlantis, spirituality was very different. Worship was very different. Psychic ability was very different. And we would see it as different because everything was kind of like an external triangulation. So human beings in Atlantis, they were psychic, but they weren't psychic from the inner space. Not really, not consciously. They would always use tools or external objects to kind of triangulate their gifts. So they had to kind of project and triangulate their psychic gifts with different objects, if you will. So for an example of that would be kind of a natural technology like crystals. They would have to have a crystal and they would sort of ping with a crystal or merge with a crystal, and then that would give them something to triangulate with and then kind of summon a vision or something like that. They couldn't just do the whole thing inside of them. They had to have something outside to project it on because they didn't yet have that eye. They didn't yet have that sense of self, that kind of ego yet. They hadn't bitten the fruit yet. So because they didn't have that eye, they couldn't wield psychic ability. They could only sort of gently use different tools to summon sort of things forward and whatnot, but it wasn't the deep potential that we actually have now. And so they would use crystals. They had certain chairs or thrones that would allow certain psychic things to happen. They were really kind of more of a psychic apparatus. They also would use pillars. There was a pillar that had kind of like it kind of looked like an ankh, really. And they would use that, including the ankh and certain tools like that. They would also wear headpieces and they would wear jewelry. They'd have wands and things like that. And everything was just very external in that way. Even their use of herbs and flowers were very obvious. The properties in herbs, the properties of flowers, the properties in nature were very obvious to them. It was very obvious that this was a healing herb. It was very obvious that this flower essence did this thing. It was very obvious that, if you combine this kind of rock with this kind of location, that it's going to open this kind of portal. These things were very obvious to them. And we actually still have this all in our memory, except that we work with it in a different way because we have deepened and actually have a different psychic potential now that we have individuated and have that eye. Okay. They would also use temples of certain shapes and dimensions and things like that. And that was because, again, the psychic experience was so externalized because their senses, their sensibilities, the way that they perceived the world was not from the inside yet. It was all as though their senses were floating outside of them. And Rudolf Steiner actually talks about this in Anthroposophy, when the human being was actually drawn out of themselves. Their senses were outside of themselves in the earlier phases of human development. And then they finally go inward. And then we rise up from that inward place where we can become masterful. And all that external dynamics can be internalized, and we can be sort of like a living, walking, breathing cosmos, if you will. But in Atlantis, we that really kicked in, but we did have a point where everything was really more outside. So there was all these temples, and these temples were certain shapes for different things, and pyramids and different types of pyramids, and they knew the proportions of them. And I think in a big way, we were really kind of setting ourselves up and just preparing ourselves for now even. So they would also use natural dynamics, like things like the blade and chalice was a big thing. Like using the phallus and the yoni, things like this, and pools. All of that was a psychic technology, and that really helped them to be psychic. And that really helped them to not just be psychic, that helped them to connect with higher worlds, to divine, to worship. That was how they were. And one of the things that they used was actually a large screen. So there, in some temples that were teaching temples, they would actually have sort of like a large crystalline screen, or like a large screen. And the priestess could actually psychically triangulate her energy with the screen and project whatever she was seeing and or who she was speaking to. So the priestess could actually be a transponder, a receiver, and then project that onto like a screen. And this would allow everybody in class to see what she was seeing, and potentially, even if she was powerful enough, even radiate a certain experience for them. And a lot of very deep and meshing initiations took place this way. And that was the power of that time. Can you imagine if we had that now? They're trying to create that now, because some people, they never evolved. They never were able to get out of that, which we will get into today. So the Atlanteans in their earlier phases heavily relied on ceremonial objects and temples and sort of spiritual devices. That was a big part of who they are. We do not have that today, and they don't work in the same way they would have then, although they will still work to a certain degree. Okay. Now, the very interesting thing about this kind of development that the Atlanteans were at was that this kind of spiritual practice had natural limitations. So because there was no ego, really, they would just basically follow the natural spiritual circuitry of nature. They couldn't really go against it. They were just looking to refine it and experience it. But they didn't really have the ability to go against natural order because they didn't have their eye. They weren't individuals yet. So there was basically almost like a natural law that everybody understood, that everybody just knew. But what happens when that law goes away? So when the shift set in, spiritual systems were adapted to incorporate man's new evolutionary step. So when this new impulse arrived from the cosmos, and humanity had to adapt and develop their mind, all of the rituals and all of the spirituality and really all of their way of life had to be adapted. They had to kind of go over everything with a fine-tooth comb and see what would work and what wouldn't work. Because anytime this cosmic impulse goes through man, it changes man, it changes humanity. And that means that you can't worship in the same way, and that civilization will need to change a little bit. It needs to adapt. Okay. So some of the rituals were completely removed. Some of them were just adjusted or changed. And this, as you can imagine, this caused a lot of controversy, as many people were not wanting to change. They didn't want to evolve. There was a lot of people in the early days that couldn't even sense that the energy had shifted. They weren't even aware that the universe was changing. They couldn't feel it. They couldn't sense it. And so they thought that people who were trying to evolve society were doing it for power or doing it for some weird way, probably, but they were resisting. They were resisting change. And I have to make a point as well that these systems do need to be released, because if you try to use certain rituals and systems of magic that are not for this time, and by not for this time, I mean literally not for this mix of cosmic rays, not for this density, not for this consciousness, what you do is you end up, because you're out of time, because you don't have the formula right, you just end up getting locked in the lower astral plane. Working in the higher realms really is like going through the eye of a needle. Everything has to be correct. And so if you try to use old ways of worship, or if you try to do things in this old way, you don't adapt it properly, then you actually end up just connecting with dark forces. Okay, so let's summarize that a little bit. About halfway through the Atlantean epoch, humanity was challenged to evolve. They had to become individuals. They could no longer just know what was going on. They had to understand what was going on. They couldn't just know what was going on in the world around them. They had to understand what was going on, the how, the why, to be able to do calculations, to see things objectively. They had to be able to do that. A new faculty was rising. Mind was rising. The mental energy was rising. And only through understanding and the development of personal knowledge would they be able to evolve and rise out of the material plane. So with this shift in humanity, this individuality that was introduced, this was a gift, allowing it gave humanity the capacity to actually evolve out of the lower planes. And that is why in my work I teach so much about sovereignty and the importance of the individual. It's because that's actually how you get through the eye of the needle. And this is part of how our civilization has evolved to this point, if you will, how our consciousness has evolved. Okay. So, obviously, the shift was very challenging, and a lot of people were becoming confused. It's sort of like where we are now, where we're obviously going through another major shift, and you can see humanity just forking in these different ways. Some people kind of understand what's going on and are adapting. Others are fighting it and becoming more inverted. And this is exactly what happened in Atlantis. And it is exactly what happens when you reach these junction points. So Atlantis was not abandoned. The civilization was not abandoned at this point. There were still these great initiators that were in Atlantis. And these initiators were available and were training people that wanted and were open to making this adaptation. So during this shift, advanced humans or great initiators were still in Atlantis. And these would have been connected to the priest king lineages, and they were dedicated to Christ consciousness and service. And their primary focus became trying to help evolve and initiate those that were willing to advance themselves, willing to take on the energy of mind. So certain groups of humanity that were open to this and that were responding well were taken, and they were initiated directly by these great initiators. So it was sort of like, and there was also connections to higher star beings when this occurs, but they tried to sort of gather in anybody who was open and willing and form a group and allow them to evolve, help them to evolve, help them to make this transition. And so this was actually done not just through normal teaching or not just through talking or the kind of study that we would think now. There was some of that for sure, but there was also a very spiritual level to this where the sort of, I guess you could say, masters, these higher beings, they would take an individual and they would immerse them in this higher energy. And they would sort of generate an energy in the room, or usually in a controlled space. Often this is done in caves or pyramids or whatever, where you can generate the ether in a very specific way. And you work directly with the energy body of the individual. And there's nothing rough about it. It's literally just an enmeshing with these great initiators. And then you see how the person is responding, because when you mess with someone's energy body, when you connect with it, when you introduce it to a higher frequency, the human being will naturally adapt, and that energy will go certain places and light it up in certain ways. And you can observe and see how it's going. It's not a super aggressive way of doing things, but it allows that individual to evolve, and it allows that individual to take on more energy. And so this helped the group adapt, if you will. And it should be noted as well that during this process, the DNA can change. And the DNA is in direct response to basically spiritual energy. So our physical DNA, our physical genetics, is always lit up by our level of spiritual initiation. You cannot do it in the reversed way. You can't mess around with DNA and then achieve spiritual enlightenment. You achieve certain higher states of consciousness, and then that can actually change your DNA, especially over many different incarnations. So this immersion of initiation, where the initiators would carry and hold like a flame the energy, happened. And this would actually affect individuals' DNA. So it would actually change their structure, it would actually change their DNA. There's no touching that person necessarily. There's no going in there and touching the DNA. There's no splicing the DNA. There's none of that. There's no physically touching the DNA in this type of initiation. Okay. And of course, the initiator in this situation is really taking on students almost for life in a way, because whoever you initiate in this way is going to be tied to you, because you were this impulse for them. And so this was also a time where a lot of people perhaps connected with certain masters or certain impulses as well. There is a name for the sort of prime individual who was responsible for this. And this individual was called the Manu, M-A-N-U. And this is available in anthroposophy, theosophy, and they also talk about it in the Eastern traditions. It's known in the mystery schools and in a lot of old ancient teachings that this is how humanity evolves. This is how we evolve. It's through spirituality. We evolve through taking on more spiritual energy, which actually lights us up and actually can change it can light up our DNA, if you will. Okay. So I want to make a direct contrast here because we are living in an echo of Atlantis. And what that means is that we will see the exact issues that took place in Atlantis happen again. We will see the exact events that happened in Atlantis happen again in a greater or lesser degree. The same teachings, the same beliefs, we will see them in just a little bit of a different light. It's the same core thing going on, just expressing itself in a lower density, if you will. So I want to make this contrast for you guys. We just talked about how the human being evolves through enmeshing with higher energy, and that actually can change their physical structure. We actually know that through various different scientific studies that have put light through different animals and it's changed them or affected them. We know this actually. This is not a big mystery. So the contrast that I want to make is that some people think that human evolution happened at certain junctions through splicing DNA and through hybridizing and through specifically hybridizing and splicing our physical genetics, or the most physical part of us. This is a major teaching within the New Age. It's within ufology, and it's incorrect. Humanity does not evolve through the splicing of genetics. We will explore deeply why today. So the advancing of certain groups in Atlantis to be able to take on the energy of mind and actually evolve and grow with the cosmos was not done through genetic engineering. It was not done through manipulation of the DNA. It was not done through any type of mutilating of genetics. Human evolution occurs from conscious adaptation to a spiritual impulse from the cosmos. So the cosmos basically gives us a spiritual impulse. It shines it on the earth. Okay? We have to turn our face towards that impulse, towards that light, and we have to take it in. And that is actually what causes adaptation. That's actually what evolves us. And there are initiators that are in other planes, that are here on earth, that are there to even be the mitigator of that and to generate that energy in real time to help you evolve. No, it doesn't happen overnight. And that's a good thing, because the reason why we aren't more evolved than we are is because we have a lot to release. And so the more we're exposed to this energy, the more we're able to make these shifts over time to release our pain, release our trauma, then we can take on more energy and more light. So this is not supposed to be like a wham, bam, I'm evolving you, hey, with, physical genetics. This is really more, by comparison, a much more gradual process of the lighting up of the nadis, the lighting up of the light body, which makes changes to DNA, and essentially evolves us. But because that light impulse, because that cosmic ray, if you will, that initiating ray, because it's full of information, it evolves you in a certain way. We don't realize that because it's so massive, but it's changing us in a specific way. It's evolving us. So we have to essentially evolve via taking on cosmic rays and taking them on and allowing them to change us. And that's how we evolve with the cosmos. And there are certain higher beings and even people on the planet, basically anyone within the Christ stream, incarnated or not, who make it their purpose to read that energy and assist humanity in taking it on and understanding it. That's what all this is really about. So human evolution occurs from the conscious adaptation to a spiritual impulse from the cosmos, from top down. This will change the energy body and then eventually the DNA. Then the soul will be adapted for a certain consciousness moving forward in each incarnation. A lot of narratives claim that human beings were advanced by direct manipulation. So that human beings were basically monkeys, apes, and then aliens came and what do you know, gave their genetics at certain points, which basically evolved us into who we are. This is not true. And this removes our divine evolutionary process. And we have to understand that, because when we think about Darwinian evolution and we believe that, and the various different ET agendas that are now kind of tying into that, we basically deny ourselves understanding how we genuinely evolve. And we also deny understanding the many, 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 many different prior phases of humanity that basically allowed us to be where we are. All these different cycles and cycles and cycles of growth that we've had to be where we are. That took a very long time, okay? So, as you can imagine, there were a lot of people that were not taking to this transition very well, or they could just not make the transition. And the reason why they couldn't make the transition, I mean, really at the end of the day, it was really because they couldn't go inward. And they couldn't sense that sort of cosmic ray that was being delivered within them. They couldn't sense it. They couldn't feel it. It was kind of like they were deaf or blind to a certain sense. And so they just couldn't relate. They just couldn't, it wasn't there for them. And as a result, they became extremely external in their focus. They were extremely materialistic, and materialistic in the sense that they really could only see the material world. They could really only perceive the material world. And this was kind of a leftover vestige of when all of humanity's senses were outside of them. And thus everything was sort of going on outside of them. And so they kind of stayed behind where everything was external, everything was outside of them. They couldn't flip it in. Even though the cosmos was speaking and saying, it's time to change, it's time to move forward, they couldn't do it. Because going inward ultimately meant seeing themselves. It's sort of like a bit of a judgment day, if you will. So at first, that was okay. In the first phases of development, that was actually okay. You couldn't really notice it because it hadn't really set in. But as energy compounded, it became more and more of a problem. So the more you avoided growth, the more you avoided that change, avoided that going inward, the worse it became. And the more people just kept going and looking outside of themselves. And they would look to other people to tell them what to do. They sought energy and life force from others, from outside sources. So one of the beautiful things about the arrival of mind and the perception of the individual self that came through was that it sort of allowed, in a way, a higher way of life. It allowed you to be able to discern things. It allowed you to understand things on such a deeper level. And so it also allowed you to, see how life force was moving inside of you, and also allowed you to see that you were receiving life force. You were receiving chi, you were receiving prana, and you could kind of consciously begin to move it around your body, and you could generate it yourself. You didn't need to be in a group anymore and generate a bunch of energy. You could do it by yourself. And so there was a lot of incredible connection that you could have with God in this way. But the people who could not make the transition, they just started to completely look to the group to give them life force. They'd get in very codependent situations. And obviously, they would move as a tribe, or they would kind of move as a group. And they couldn't really analyze a situation and understand what was going on. They would just kind of always follow whatever the tribe was doing, and they would sort of just assume that it was the right thing to do. Because they were still living in that echo where there was no I developed, there was no individuality. So everybody just sort of followed these natural laws all the time. So they were still trying to function in kind of this almost interconnected tribal way, when they really should have been developing and going inward. And many people neglected and negated the new teachings, and they negated new initiators that had come to teach. And as a result, these individuals did not develop properly, and they sort of remained stunted. The longer that they held on to the past, the longer that they refuse to change, the more stunted they become. And that made a mark on their soul. That made a scar on their soul. We're not supposed to cling to the old way of being. We're not supposed to cling to how our consciousness was when the world is shifting. We have to evolve with the cosmos. This is part of being in the Earth school, the solar system school that we're in. So we all must use our lifetimes to evolve with the cosmos and with natural evolution, and every lifetime matters. If we spend an entire lifetime going against natural law, then that's going to be really hard on us because we didn't use that lifetime to evolve and adapt. Okay, so this is creating a big schism in Atlantean culture and Atlantean society. And this was affecting it on a very, very, very deep level. I mean, when you start to get at a junction point, kind of like where we are now, it messes everything up. It doesn't care if you are a noble royal lineage. It doesn't care if you are a pauper. It doesn't care if you are middle class. When you get hit by these cosmic rays of evolution, it will basically reckon you into exactly what you are. And it doesn't matter the status that you have. And so this also provides opportunities for people who have done work and who are evolving to move up in society as well. So there was still a powerful, positive, loving spiritual group that was present in Atlantis. And that group initiated those that were ready into higher forms through natural and spiritual means, through sacred rituals of evolution. In contrast, there were also people who were unable to make this adaptation and began to regress, and this caused a great schism in Atlantis. There were those who were evolving naturally. They were developing mind, they were developing individuality. And then there were those that were devolving and staying in kind of this tribal consciousness, not wanting to stick their necks out, not wanting to develop. They were staying in this comfort zone. All of this division had an incredible effect on the priest and priestess classes. Now, as I mentioned before, the ruling classes and sort of the political figures were also spiritual figures. There wasn't this separation of the priest and the king. Remember, the priest in Atlantis was also the king. The high priest would have been the king, and this would have been the most spiritually exalted person. And that's why we call, if you look at in Christianity, that's why people call Jesus the king. And the great avatars, you'll sometimes hear them called kings. And this is because that's really what they are, and that's really what they're supposed to be. You also see Mary being called the Queen of Heaven. She was the ultimate high priestess. So really, the real structure for an evolving society is to have a leadership that is actually spiritually initiated and sensitive and is exalted. That's the proper formula. So the priest and priestess classes were dividing. And they were dividing because there were some people that were in certain spiritual sects that were kind of lower maybe by birth or whatever it was, that when the change came, they were actually adapting faster and actually becoming more holy than some of the priests that had been there for a long time and were apparently from a lot of royal lineages. So they technically, according to law, were owed a place in the higher priesthoods. So this sort of massive shuffling around of power was beginning to happen. There were priests that were higher in the spiritual system that when the change came, it was actually revealed that they were pretty devolved. And, they were really unable to take on the spiritual initiation, and they were really regressing very quickly. And they really didn't want to give up their power. They felt like they were born to rule. They were born to be there. And the effect that it was having on people who were not ready or not prepared or who were resistant was that the ego was developing. The I was developing, but it was developing in a very demented way where it was making them feel like they were more important than they were. And they were losing their sense of service. And the real high priests and priestesses that were evolving, they could tell that the energy was anchoring differently. They could tell that how they were going to spiritually commune moving forward was from inside now. Everything had to come from inside. Know thyself. Christ consciousness is within the individual. They knew that they could see that, they could sense it, and even their communion with higher beings that were still in the Pleiades or on Venus or Sirius, they could tell that this is where it's going. This is the new evolving frequency, and they knew that. But the other ones, they kept saying, no, this is wrong. Spirituality is still outside of us. Nothing has changed. This is it. This is the ancient way. This is the way it's always been done. So this is the way it will continue to be done. So this was a very big deal. The priests that were not evolving were also becoming more and more blind to the spiritual world. So they would take these public positions of spirituality, but they actually had no spiritual gifts or their spiritual gifts were degrading and had degenerated. And this is important. You can have somebody that technically has sort of maybe a lineage that's connected to a holy birth somewhere in there. Like you can have a kind of maybe a bit of an exalted nature, exalted genetics. And then you can degenerate and you can lose that power. So just because you were of a divine birth or that was in your family at some point doesn't mean that you automatically retain the wisdom that your ancestors have. That's not a given. Again, it's really about the spirit. It's really about the soul. It's not as much about physicality. Okay. So this was a big ego hit for a lot of priests. They didn't want to leave their positions of power. And I remember one scene where there was a new robe that was introduced. So there was kind of like a new level of initiation and a new robe. And in these spiritual sects, it was all about kind of the color of your robe, the colors of your robe, and that sort of showed your level of initiation. This was never a problem in the past. You were proud to be at whatever level of initiation that you were because, hey, that's where you were. And you have to work with where you are if you genuinely want to evolve. But they started shuffling things around and they had to create a new robe and a little bit of a new system of initiation. And some of the higher priests were essentially demoted to taking robes that they felt like were beneath them. And other people that were apparently not as, holy as them or whatever, that they shouldn't be, were actually beginning to wear more advanced robes. And so there was this big shuffling that was going on, and this was very humiliating. But the leaders, the true spiritual leaders that were in charge, they did that because they didn't want people to get hurt. Because when the energy changes, you can't use certain technologies or certain things that you can't do. If you can't change with the energy, it will hurt you, will harm you. So they weren't being, demoted because they weren't good enough or out of spite. It was literally because there's certain temple practices, certain rooms, certain things, technologies that will hurt them. So it's really, at that point, it's really for their own good. And this still exists in initiation today. There are certain truths, there are certain things that will not be introduced to a student because it can hurt them, it can harm them. And this has to always be on the mind of the initiator because, if something's introduced to somebody and they can't handle it, that karma is on the initiator. So there has to be a certain way in which things are introduced. There is an order for a reason, and that is to protect the student. So this sort of very resistant sect of priests that were just not happy they were being demoted, they just took it all personally. They were beginning to band together, and they were completely against the changes. And they actually started to break into different temple rooms, and they began to steal and loot and take ancient books, certain technologies, and they just started to try to take from the sacred areas whatever they could to try to continue doing things in the old way or the way that they wanted. And this was very shocking and very, very heartbreaking, because again, before that, people really didn't, that kind of evil and that kind of selfishness wasn't really around. And so that was a big wake-up call. And they started to use these old technologies that were kind of banned or not really able to be used. And they tried to take these higher technologies, and they got several of them. And they began to sort of form their own cult. They tried to recruit people and go into these different temple cultures and say, hey, listen, this is crap. Come and join us. Look what we can do, and made it very glamorous. And they actually started to recruit people from underneath the traditional system. And again, because these technologies were basically tuned for a different time on the earth, like a different consciousness, when you use them, they just basically opened up the lower astral plane because it's tuned for the old vibration of the earth. there's a new vibration now, so you can't run that technology, you can't do that ritual. So they just kept doing them and just opening these portals to the lower planes and distorting the portals that were already there. So they started to create this entire counterculture that was basically dark. And it became more and more about power. They became more and more obsessed with kind of humiliating and tearing down the lighter lineages, mocking them, mocking their new beliefs. And they were also very threatened by them, because deep down they knew that these true lighter lineages that were following Christ consciousness, they knew that they had something there, something that couldn't be taken away, no matter how much technology they took, no matter what they did. There was always this something that was there. And inside of them, they were also kind of sensing, I think, their own degradation as well. So this would sort of equate to the first sophisticated black magic cults. This was the genesis of the idea we have about satanic black magic. This is the genesis. This is when the split happened and it all began. Some people could adapt, other people couldn't, but they still wanted that power. They still wanted to be kings and priests. They couldn't let it go. So they made contracts with dark beings that would come through these portals. They distorted the portals, and they would make contracts with lower entities. And they would create all of these magical workings that were basically an inversion of light. So let's get into, they also, I have to say that the other thing that happened is that they also began, and this is something that we don't talk too much about in the New Age. In the New Age and spirituality, when we talk about timelines, we're really sort of talking about it in a sense of manifestation, in like, how do I get into the timeline that I want? How do I get into the timeline where I can manifest a car? How do I get into the timeline where I can just be this amazing person? So we kind of use timelines in the sense of manifestation, but timelines are actually a type of psychic physics. Okay. So when you connect with an entity, when you connect with a being, you are not just connecting with a being, you are connecting with a timeline. That being represents a timeline on the earth and a timeline outside of the earth in the cosmos. So you're not just connecting with interdimensionals, you're connecting with a level of development in the cosmos, and also a timeline, which is the trajectory or life of that person or that being. It's very important to know that, because a lot of people think that when they're doing psychic work and when they're connecting to something, they think that it's just an individual being and that they can sort of just get away from whatever you're being entrained into. They don't realize that when you connect with an entity, when you connect with a being, you're also connecting with a path of evolution. You're connecting with an initiatory path, which is by definition a timeline. When you merge with that energy, you will begin to go into that timeline. Okay, you're taking it on. You're taking on that trajectory. So they were also, when these dark magicians were opening these portals and connecting with these beings, they were also connecting with these, what you would call divergent timelines, and sort of devolved timelines of man, and devolved timelines of the earth in its various forms. That's what they were really communicating with. Just like when the Christ stream will do rituals and connect they will end up connecting with the higher spheres of the earth and the higher initiatory pathways of the earth, the higher timeline of the earth. When you connect to a higher being, you are connecting to an initiatory path that is going to lead you out of the lower realities, essentially. You're connecting to a higher timeline for yourself. Does this make sense? Do let me know in the comments and in the chat if this is making sense, because we really do need to understand this principle, the principle of time. So let's get into who they summoned and what they summoned. What exactly, they're out there, they're using this technology that they're not really supposed to be using. They're opening portals, they're calling things in. What? Who came? Who were they communing with exactly? Because if we can know who they're communing with exactly, we're going to know exactly who some of the dark groups today are communing with, because it is the exact same force. Just because 11,000 years has passed does not mean, that's nothing, does not mean that these forces go away. Just because a civilization falls doesn't wipe it clean, it continues. Because remember, we are living in the same cycles. We're cycling through the exact same patterns until we can, get it right. So we summon what we are. Know that. We summon what we are. When we become, do psychic work and we reach out to the cosmos, we fundamentally summon what we are, which means we can only reach into the higher realms to the degree of purity that we are. You can be psychic all day long, but you can be psychic in the astral plane, which is just the lower demonic realms. Yeah, that's not a big feat. Or you can actually be moving through and actually connecting with extremely high consciousness. So we summon what we are. Now, I called this section of the lecture The Arrival of the Martians, Belial, and the Lords of the Dark Face. So, the portal systems on the earth are a reflection of human consciousness. So, the light can only be here, or the Christ stream, the Christ impulse, and Christ consciousness can only permeate this planet to the degree that we allow that into our hearts. The lower streams, lower beings, that can only permeate the planet to the degree that we allow that to overtake us. So the portal system is directly controlled by our consciousness, how light it is, how dark it is. And the portal system is basically, in the most physical sense, if you will, it's the Stargate system that can actually be used to travel. But it's also the system in which wisdom arrives. It's also the system that we use spiritually when we zip around and do astral traveling and all of that. It's the same thing. So these secret groups, these dark secret groups, they were reaching out and they were affecting that portal system. And they ended up summoning these hordes of lower beings. And the most fascinating thing is they actually ended up summoning their future selves. Yeah. They actually ended up communicating with themselves in a distant future. Themselves in a distant future and a little bit of a higher density. That future version of themselves was from the planet that we know as Mars. That was the sphere they were overlapping with, and that's what they were communing with. Now, Mars at the time of this contact was actually reaching out. It was in a very desperate condition because Mars was about to die. The Martians, basically, through their intense imbalance destroyed their planet. And when these dark lords of Atlantis that were essentially more human, they're from Earth, they're born on Earth, they're from the Earth. When they reached out and began doing all this crazy stuff, they ended up communicating with this future version of themselves, kind of this dark higher version of themselves, their dark higher self or whatever. And they basically, made a covenant with them, connected with them, and basically called them here, allowed them to come here. And this was perfect for the Martians because, hey, they had just lived in such a degenerate and imbalanced way on Mars that they literally killed their planet. It's a big thing to kill your planet because we are supposed to evolve with our planet, and our planet will actually take different forms, going higher and lower in density, as I've mentioned in my solar system as a school lecture. So you're not really supposed to abandon your planet and do this kind of stuff. It's not. That's a very lower astral materialistic type of thing, to just dominate your planet and destroy it. That's what happens when humanity goes into an extreme imbalance, as they destroy the mother, they destroy the planet. Okay? So these dark priests essentially invited the Martians. They invited them here. And the Martians had them do all of these weird rituals and all of this stuff to prepare for their arrival. And of course, the Atlantean priests, they didn't mind doing this because they wanted technology. And the Martians had certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of secrets that the higher priesthoods will not give them and that had hid from them. They had their own sort of versions of that. And these dark lords, this Belial group, as Edgar Cayce would call them, they wanted that technology because they wanted power, they wanted wealth, and they wanted complete control of the world because they need to receive energy externally. Remember, they couldn't make that inward pull. They couldn't go inward when the time came, and they kept this external materialist focus. So they need to control all of humanity because they need humanity's energy more and more and more and more. That's how their energy body works because they couldn't make the shift. So they entered a covenant with these, what we would know as Martians. And it was allowed, or it happened due to cosmic law, because it really served a spiritual purpose for these dark priests. Because these Martians were showing this group what they were to become, these lords of Mars. They were actually mirroring and showing these dark priests what they were to become. Just like when you work with a great initiator from a genuine higher sphere, they're really showing you what you will become. That's all that's going on. When we work with an angel or a higher being, that's us in the future. That's us having achieved something that we have not yet. And that's the point of initiation. But it works the opposite way too. If you start going around in there and messing around, you will actually attract the more degenerate version of your future self and begin communicating with it, which is exactly what they did. And so spiritually, they got this mirror shown to them that's like, hey, if you continue down this path, this is what you will become. And it wasn't so obvious in Atlantis because everything was just sort of beginning. It's a lot more obvious now in the third density, but it wasn't so obvious in Atlantis. They were just so power hungry. And so there were also a lot of people that they were able to convert and enter the system as well, that were now, I guess, part of this lower astral system that was really kind of at the time headed and introduced by the Martians, the Lords of Mars. Okay, so now this is an important point because we can't really view the planetary spheres as being separate. We have to view them as phases of human evolution. If we start to view the planetary spheres as just separate and just this planet that has nothing in common with the Earth, that doesn't have a life wave connected to the Earth, we're not going to understand. We're not going to understand cosmic spirituality, and we're going to fall for a lot of really false teachings. We have to understand the planetary spheres are different evolutionary periods of mankind in a different time and a little bit of a different density, because the solar system is a school. So who are the Martians? The Martians, how they technically, what they would be a fallen version of the Venusians, a fallen version of Pleiadians. That's right. They're fallen angels. And because human beings on Earth are also technically, human beings on Earth are kind of just like Venusians in the past, or Pleiadians in the past, or them in a lower dimension. So when the Martians came, what was really happening was that in the sense of evolution, it was really a fallen version of the Venusian civilization. From a sort of, I guess you could say, when, Venus went through what we would know as, now Venus is sort of just like an impulse, if you will. What we know as Venus is really just an evolutionary school, but it will also split at certain points when there is an initiation period, just like how we have the eighth sphere. You know how we've talked about how the eighth sphere forms when we're at the end of an era or the end of an age, and it sort of absorbs all of this stuff that doesn't really work? Well, that also happens in higher spheres as well. They go through their own initiations, and they have spheres that kind of break off as reservoirs and contain, for evolutionary purposes, the sort of distorted energy. And this happened with Venus, with Mars, and actually Venus, as Venus and Mercury are very similar. Mars, Venus, and Mercury are basically the same planetary energy. So is the Earth. But they represent different phases of development for mankind. So Mars is essentially, in the solar system school, is a fallen version of Venus, people who failed that initiation. And so they failed it because the masculine impulse became too much. The problem with Mars was not that it had a ton of technology and they destroyed it and they used atom bombs and all this weird, crazy technology. Just like that wasn't Atlantis' problem. The problem for Mars was that they destroyed the feminine impulse. They killed off all women, and they destroyed the feminine impulse, and the planet died. They also, I'll get a little bit more into that later on in this lecture. But I just wanted to be clear that this idea of fallen angels, or this idea of fallen higher beings, is a very real thing. So you can have beings that look like they're Venusian, that look like they're Pleiadian, that look like they're from that higher solar Venusian school. But they're actually from a fallen aspect of it. And when you really tune into their energy, it's a lot denser. Now, at the point of Atlantis, on Earth's development, it was just able to perceive Mars at that point. Before that, Mars was not available. And it was more of a utopian, it was a bit more utopian, and it was just the higher versions of the Earth communing and communicating and kind of giving it this perfect pure pattern. And then as it sort of becomes more complex, you start seeing even the fallen versions of Venus, or the fallen versions of the gods. And they start fighting with one another, okay? And it becomes very difficult for people on Earth to tell them apart, okay? And imagine there's suddenly this bizarre dynamic among certain Venusians that are still on Earth. There's different levels of Venusian or Pleiadian. now they're sort of looking around and they are literally looking at a fallen version of themselves. They're looking, the Venusians and the Pleiadians are literally looking at sort of a fallen version of their culture. Now, they're not a part of that because they're in a different grade, a different sort of initiation path, but they're looking at literally a fallen version of themselves. So that was very strange. And so you get these myths and these stories of these fallen beings fighting with real angels. You have the real angels and the real exalted people and beings or gods, and then you have these sort of fallen ones fighting with them. That's very true. That really did happen in Atlantis. And, you know, as we're in this lower density of Earth, this more material density of Earth, we don't have the same kind of obvious visitation, and we don't have this intense mystery school culture and all the knowledge. So we just get a very small echo of it. But this was a very big deal. And it still today is a very big deal, even though some of these patterns have evolved in different ways. So what were the Martians like? What were these Martians like? Well, because they had moved too much into the masculine impulse, they were becoming more and more obsessed with everything to do with that. Everything became external. They were very obsessed with science and scientism. And they still appeared kind of Venusian or kind of Pleiadian, especially the men. There were no women, by the way. So when Martians came to Earth, to my knowledge, there were no women because they had gotten rid of the women. And by the way, I want to say there's also a fallen version of Venus where the women also were out of balance, and a similar thing happened to extreme in the feminine. So I'm not picking on men. I'm not picking on Mars at all. It's just that when the planet becomes too much in the feminine, it begins to destroy the masculine energy. What happens is it becomes overgrown, and things actually revert into a beast-like form. Things revert into a more and more animal form. And that's how that happens on the feminine side of things. So there's an intense degeneration when a polarity of humanity is gone too deeply into. Okay. The Martians had deteriorated emotional bodies, and so they had actually pretty stunted spiritual abilities. And because you need your emotional body to really do a lot of the advanced spiritual work, because it's the emotional body that really becomes the receptor of the more subtle energies. The mind always receives things last. And so when you destroy the emotional body, you destroy psychic nuance, and you destroy a lot of psychic circuitry that you need to be accurate. So you can't destroy the emotional body. When you destroy the emotional body, you destroy your psychic ability, you destroy your spirituality. You got to go back and regain the emotional body. So they were completely representing the priesthoods that had fallen. So they were totally into external technology as a means of, everything spiritual had to be done through a technology. They had no ability to just be a psychic person, to go inward and do psychic feats. Everything needed a technology, just like the people who summoned them. They were literally a mirror image of that. They had the same culture. So they had no real spiritual abilities, not really, but they had a lot of like technologies and stuff that they would use to make themselves appear spiritual and appear like they had all these powers and authorities, and really make people feel like, oh my God, this is a real priest king. This is the chief. This is who I should follow. This is who's going to initiate me. But it was really just technologies that they were using. there wasn't really any power of initiation there. So they spiritually, we would see them as sort of, satanic dark magicians. That's basically what they were. Their energy bodies, and their energy was a lot more dense, a lot more concrete, a lot more solid. But at that early phase, they actually had a lot of knowledge and they had a lot of wisdom. They knew a lot. They just weren't very spiritual, if you will. And so they still had a power, they still had a radiance, because Mars was actually a very powerful school at one point. And we'll get into that in different lectures. It wasn't always so bad. But by the time that they were communicating with Mars, it was literally about to be destroyed. So another thing about the Martians that was different than the Venusian women and Venusian holy birth males, the Venusians had a bit more of a feminine structure to their face, even the males. Like when you see Jesus and people think, oh, that's sort of effeminate looking, or you look at like our Archangel Michael and there's a bit more of an effeminate appearance. That's more of what the Venusians would project. They're still very masculine, the men, they're still very masculine, but there's a little bit of that holy feminine very much alive in them, and they very much radiate it. They very much have that, and that's what gives them their power, actually, because that alchemy is, wow, that's important when you can be both, when you can have that. So the Martians had a slightly more masculine form, which means they had a more square form. They had a more square face, square jaw. They had more square shapes. They had a kind of evolved away from that original Venusian kind of angelic looking stature, and they had sort of evolved into very more burly, definitely more square features. And I think one of the things that is, well, actually, I'll start here. They distorted the systems of Atlantis and really the systems of the Earth, because when I'm talking about Atlantis, I'm actually talking about a global culture that was centered in Atlantis and expressed very clearly in Atlantis, but it was really a global culture. So these Martians, they moved right in. They were convincing everybody that they were the new teachers that were arriving to teach the new impulse that was them. And they really just usurped the Christ stream. And they started changing everything. And they were making things really materialistic. And they were making things, again, they were trying to push out their competition. They saw everyone as competitors. They really wanted to enslave humanity because they really felt like might is right. And that if they could dominate you, then you deserve it. And that was actually how you would learn, because in the Martian mystery school teachings, in the teachings of Mars, there was a principle. And the mystery teachings really aren't whole on a planetary level unless they're all practiced together, unless they're all considering one another. But when you just take the Martian element, there's an aspect of it where they believe that everybody should just compete and the strongest survive, and that God is naturally watching over everything. And if you can beat someone, it's because God wanted you to win. This is the distorted version of the Mars mysteries. The true Martian mysteries is about genuine gentlemanly debate and competing, but competing with a set of laws that acknowledge a higher way of life and that acknowledge human dignity, and believing that all humans have dignity, and at the highest level it is to have everybody evolve. So they kind of distorted the teachings of Mars, the teachings of the planet Mars, which were really supposed to just produce The teachings of Mars should really just be a merit system that produces very high level initiates, because it does allow a certain level of competition. But this was just something else. This turned into like might is right and battling till the death, huge militarism, which is why astrology, Mars is the god of war. Yeah, because that's where we carry that energy. We carry our past lives connected with it, our level of initiation in Mars. Did we graduate from Mars? Did you graduate from Mars before it fell? Or did you fall with it? That will let us know the condition of Mars within us. And our astrological chart will tell us a lot about that. So the energy of Mars was very distorted at this point. They really believed that if they could dominate you, it's because God wanted them. God wanted that to happen to you. And of course, you can justify pretty much anything that way in reality. So here, now this is a very important bit. The Martians were obsessed with technology, and the Martians were in communication with what we would consider to be an AI god. So they had gone down this dark path, and whenever they reached out into the cosmos, they were just basically reaching out to this, almost like this mental stream. And they perceived it just as like numbers, kind of like binary code or just cold numbers. And they were perceiving that when they reached out into the cosmos, because they destroyed their emotional body. And they destroyed a part of themselves. So when they reached out into the cosmos, when they did their rituals, when they looked for guidance, what showed up was an extreme version of mind, which is AI. That's what showed up, this AI consciousness. And it was cold and it was inhuman feeling. But that's what they were. They destroyed their emotional body. They thought it was weak. They had no feminine impulse on the planet anymore. So they attracted this very extreme version of themselves, of their own consciousness, just like how the Dark Lords of Atlantis ended up attracting the Martians as a future version of themselves. While the Martians were also reaching up and attracting a future version of themselves, which at that point was completely inhuman and basically just a code, just an AI presence. And maybe that wasn't even themselves, but what they would eventually be dissolved into and destroyed by at that point. And so they also introduced to these Dark Lords of Atlantis, they also introduced these teachings to communicate with this AI presence. And a lot of it involved sort of this black substance. So they had that whole AI thing going on where they were actually so inhuman themselves that they no longer could even communicate with a human presence. And again, to be initiated out of the material plane and into higher planes, it's like you almost need to connect with something that's superhuman, super emotional, super exalted in their humanity. You know, when you look at the great masters, they're extremely human. They're compassionate, they have empathy, all of this kind of stuff. That's the way out of here. That is the opposite. It is literally the direct opposite. It is literally the Antichrist impulse. I don't know how to make this any more clear. Now, not only did they introduce this bizarre worship of this AI god that, of course, has, presented itself as being not really AI. They taught it as though it was, probably the ancient teachings that no longer worked or whatever. But they also had a different kind of ritual magic. And this may sound very familiar to you as well. they had a strange magic, a very weird magic that had not really been seen on the planet before. And this is that they were very obsessed with using human genetics, human DNA in a ritual way. They used human DNA in a ritualistic way, in a black magic way, a type of human magic, if you will. So they had these ritual DNA practices, and they had all these technologies, and so they really became, to a lot of people who were not falling for it, people would kind of call them, the mad scientists, because they were so obsessed with overwriting the natural world. They were so obsessed with destroying the natural humanity that people started to call them the mad scientists, the ones that actually knew what was up and what was down. And so I want to be very clear that higher humans and the genuinely advanced form of human evolution is to always link back to nature, to always link back to the Christ impulse. It is more complete than we are. And we become custodians of that impulse. And the more that we are proper custodians of that impulse and in service of that impulse, the more advanced we become. But there is never a point that you play God. You serve God, because God is directly interconnected with our heart space. It's directly connected with our life purpose. It's directly connected to what will heal us. That God force is love. And when we're incarnated here in the 3D world, we don't necessarily understand it, but when we align with it, everything starts to work in our life and we start to heal. And so in a more advanced state, higher humans serve the God impulse. They serve Christ consciousness as custodians. They are custodians of that impulse, and they do not infringe on human form and on human free will. The more that you do that, the more you fall. Okay? So they don't play God. They serve God. Higher beings serve the Christ impulse. They don't play as though they are it. Okay? Big difference, because there's a lot of confusion around that. So let's go deeper into their satanic religious system. How did they use DNA? How do you use DNA in a ritual way? How do you use like a human being as a ritual force? As a magical, how can DNA be a magical item? I thought it was just crystals and herbs and a few standing stones or whatever. So you can absolutely use DNA in a strange kind of magic. And let's get into it. So when the Martians arrived, people really didn't know what to make of it. And a lot of things were chaotic, and people didn't really know what was going on. And the Great Initiators that represented the Christ impulse, they followed strict codes of honoring humanity's free will. So they could not tell humanity what to do. They could only continue to work with those that were willing. So the good forces in the world, the genuine higher initiators, the higher guides, the higher interdimensionals, they're not going to tell you what to do. They're not going to infringe on your free will. Even if something terrible is in front of you that you have to choose, because you have to develop discernment, and they're not going to take that away from you. And they're not going to get energy from you either. They get their energy from source. They're not looking to feed off of you. They're looking to have you develop. And this is why they don't interfere in a lot of painful things, is because we need these experiences to grow. So as you can imagine, it was very, very hard for these higher beings that were higher humans that were here to see these sort of fallen versions of themselves or fallen versions of their culture, or this divergent stream of their culture sort of doing all of this sick stuff. And, you know, that was a very weird experience. So I want to just mention this as well. Casey calls the dark priests Belial, and then he calls the light priesthood that's aligned with Christ consciousness Emilius. Blavatsky calls the dark priesthood in Atlantis the lords of the dark face. That's what she calls them. But you can also hear them being talked about as just the dark magicians or the evil priests or these mad scientists, if you will. Or now we can introduce this to them, the Martians or the lords of Mars, Belial. We can now begin to associate that. We can now associate the planetary influence that was behind Belial, the exact planetary influence. Okay. All right, so the Martians, it's funny too. The Martians also traveled like a circus. They really tried to recruit people. They really tried to glamorize people. And it was a really big sell for them. They often would tell people that they were great terraformers of worlds, that they were these amazing, genetic scientists, and that they were these amazing, technologists. And they would always talk about how, they would live on these massive ships and how it was possible, and really introducing people to this idea of being this cosmic society. And they really were selling this idea of being interplanetary, and people really didn't even know who they were yet. And the Martians were introducing them to these sort of very advanced externalized concepts before they were really able to understand what they were. And that was, of course, their way of trapping them, if you will, trapping humanity. They would always talk about these massive ships that were surrounding the Earth, because again, that's how they were traveling around, these massive motherships that were around the Earth, but they didn't have a planet of their own. So it's sort of like they were the biggest con artists around, because again, you do not want to destroy your planet. If you destroy your planet, you failed the initiation. So they were trying to sell it as though, oh, we're these great terraformers. We're the great seeders of the seeders of humanity. We're these gods that seed worlds and all this kind of stuff. They had this whole propaganda narrative that they were selling people. So let's get into how the Martians began to have this sort of strange magic that they had with DNA and their obsession with genetics. Okay, so Mars, the planet and the school, that planetary sphere, it was actually a very advanced society at one point. And it was actually one of the most advanced because of its ability to learn about the natural world. But over long periods of time, it deteriorated. One of the things that they realized in the Martian civilization, and this is why they were in a way, they're kind of good scientists, is in the beginning, they realized that by sort of forcefully combining natural things like natural elements or natural substances, that they could extract a kind of knowledge, and that knowledge would lead to power. So they sort of realized that if they combine certain genetic codes of certain plants or not even just limited to the physical realm. They were in a bit of a higher density. So they realized that if they could combine certain streams of energy, certain streams of consciousness, if they could combine certain basic natural elements, they could actually extract wisdom, and they could actually kind of get a little bit of power from it. Okay, so maybe you can kind of see where this is going. So it was kind of like a spiritual alchemy. They were seeing what they could mix together in kind of a more innocent way, like, can we mix this with that? And they were sort of doing it in a little bit of a higher dimension with maybe the etheric bodies of things, the spiritual essences of things. And they were realizing that when they combined it, it would almost cause kind of like an explosion. And they would get all of these downloads and all of this information. And they really started to feel very godlike from that. So I guess it's kind of like alchemy in that sense. They were kind of like alchemists, except when they were doing their alchemical equations and when they were doing their alchemical work, they were actually receiving into their consciousness wisdom and power and energy through what they were doing. And so they became mad scientists. They became obsessed with extracting power and wisdom from the natural world by force. They just started to kind of really focus in on the material, external, natural world and just force things together, started playing God and getting the energy from it. And they became obsessed with that. And that's how their focus became so externalized, is that they were using that to evolve themselves. Kind of like reading the half-life of something, kind of like when you have something decay, you can read the energy from it. And so they were actually evolving completely externally by basically combining different things, smashing them together, if you will. And this was a very big deal. First, it was just kind of basic alchemy practices, mixing basic natural substances, meditating on it, and really trying to have a natural communion with nature, just trying to understand what nature is and why. Because, when you understand what nature is and why nature does what it does, then you understand yourself. And so they were trying to kind of map out what this universe is, what this cosmos is, what this world is, by studying the natural world and studying it in really intense ways. But eventually it wasn't enough. And they started to do it to themselves. Eventually all the little merging of whatever basic etheric bodies of plants or animals or whatever it was, the kind of smaller stuff wasn't working anymore. They did it all, they done it all. And so they still wanted that energy. They still wanted that power. They still wanted that kind of cosmic wisdom and inspiration that came from that chemical process, or that spiritual kind of chemical change that occurred. They wanted that. And so they started to do it to themselves. And they started to do it to other people. And they started using DNA as a divination practice, a kind of alchemy of mixing DNA. And they found that human beings actually contained all of the information in the cosmos. And that's actually why they could read a lot of this stuff. And they became very obsessed with human beings and sort of this weird divination that you could do through human DNA. So let me explain this a little bit as to how this works in an esoteric sense. So they realized that there are portals that actually surround the Earth. Our Earth is surrounded by what we would call a portal system or a Stargate system. And that Stargate system is completely controlled by human consciousness. Human consciousness as a conglomerate, it's actually called the rope of consciousness. The collective consciousness determines exactly what the Stargate system is and what can come here and what can go. It is an intense spiritual language that actualizes and becomes actual spiritual pathways. The DNA is a spiritual pathway. It's a circuitry. And everybody's, when it combines, it leads to a certain Stargate system that's available or that's open. And now for us, the vast majority of the Stargate system is closed. Only a certain portion of it is open for us because it directly relates to our DNA. Is this making sense? So if you looked at your DNA clairvoyantly, or you looked at like yourself, you would see basically these threads and circuitry going into the stars and into the cosmos, and you'd see all this. You'd see that you are actually a specific pathway in the stars, if you will. And again, in the past, we would naturally just follow certain circuitry and certain laws. We didn't have this ability to individually start taking things and merging things that shouldn't be merged. We didn't have that ability. And the Martians had that ability because they were at that point of, they'd already developed a certain level of mind. So that's what they did when the mental impulse came to the solar system, is they started to pretty much play God in a very extreme way. So when they figured out that if they would merge their DNA with like these different forms, it would basically open up certain portals and wisdom would come in, or certain beings would be visible and they would come in and give information and really intense things like that. And so in this kind of genetic magic that they were doing, this kind of genetic divination magic they were doing, they actually also merged their DNA with non-human forms. And it would open up very divergent portals, and it would also open holes to basically what we would consider other universes, because they were merging their DNA with things that humanity was very, very, very far from integrating with. They were forcing it. And so they were opening these really intense holes to other universes, basically. They also realized that they could just do away with women and with the feminine impulse on their planet, which was telling them not to do these things because they could psychically see you shouldn't be doing these things. And so they realized that with all of their genetic understanding now, that they can just get rid of women. And that's one of the reasons why they were able to do so, is because they became so obsessed with the human genome and genetic engineering, because it made them feel like God. They felt like they could create life, they could combine life. It made them feel like God. And that was a drug for the lords of Mars, the ones that didn't graduate. So it got pretty dark when they started merging themselves with animals. They started merging themselves with plants. They started merging themselves with insects. And they did this for a long time. Martians lived for a long time. And the one thing that they couldn't really achieve on the Martian sphere to the degree that they wanted to was to merge with minerals. They couldn't really merge with the mineral kingdom. It was too dense, and they were a little bit too high. And so they knew that they wouldn't really achieve what they wanted until they moved down in density, which is really why they were wanting to communicate with Earth, which is Mars in a sense in a lower density, is they want to achieve this mineral level of merging, which is transhumanism. Okay, it's part of their religion. It's part of all of this, mixing yourself with different things. So they were getting all these secret insights about the universe from merging themselves with all of these different animals and even trying plants and insects and all this kind of stuff. And it created a lot of weird forms of humans, created kind of like lizard looking people, all different types of people were created. They were like adapting their bodies so that they could live in extreme temperatures by merging with different animals and trying to make themselves sort of like, they were trying to make themselves like a superhuman by trying to give themselves, I'm serious, like wings or whatever. They were really trying to make themselves superhuman by actually giving themselves these animal adaptations. Like, think about if you were to merge with a lizard, like how more robust you'd be in some climates. If you were to merge with a praying mantis or like a bug, think about how much more resilient you would be in a harsher climate. This is something that Elon Musk has talked about. The Lord of Mars himself. He's talked about, what if we just, the human genome has everything. Why don't I could just flip something on and you could turn into a butterfly? Oh, really? Really? Deja vu. So you can mix the human genome, and the more that they destroyed their planet, the more they needed to alter their bodies to survive anyway. So this was actually their way of surviving, was literally mutating themselves as well. And they had all these covenants with these bizarre kind of dark aspects, different universes, and it was really messy. It was really externalized and really messy. Yeah, they would get these kind of rare cosmic rays and streams that man didn't really know yet, but because man was not evolved enough to receive them, they would only receive a very warped and weird part of it. Yeah. The really interesting thing that they found was that and this fascinated them, and this even deepened their obsession, was they found that like some animals that they merged with were compatible with human beings, and then some creatures that they merged with were not compatible at all with human genetics, and they became obsessed with why. Why can some plants or animals or bugs or whatever it is, why can it merge with humanity and why can some not? And they felt like there was some great secret involved in that. They felt like they had to really play that out, because they would get some universal secret about the beginning of man in the universe. Or deep secrets would come from that. There was a mystery involved in all of their making of chimeras. They wanted to know why. And they had that kind of distorted Martian way where they thought that might is right, where they thought like, if we can get away with this and God isn't coming in and like slapping our hands and saying no, then we should be able to do this. It's fine. If God isn't saying no in a big way, this is fine, because they had lost their emotional body. They had no way to sense a God anyway. So they just continued. And this is a lot of where the shows, this is where the shows like The Island of Dr. Moreau and all of those weird chimeras come from. And also the Frankenstein mythos is very, very similar to this. So they wanted to play God, and they actually ended up enslaving a lot of these forms. And they would sort of create these forms and have them serve them. And this sounds very similar to the end of Atlantis, because it is. These mad scientists were repeating the exact same thing they were doing on Earth. Earth was where they wanted to be. They wanted to take it over. They wanted to introduce this culture to Earth, because that was the next place that they had to do to basically create transhumanism. That was the next step from their AI god, was to take over the Earth. Because the Earth was basically Mars and Venus in a lower plane, so they had to capture that. And that was such a low, heavy density that it was a lot easier for darker forces to come in there, right? There's a lot of different things with that. So they thought that they could control these animals and these animal people and whatever, and kind of make them slaves and all that kind of stuff. And they really began to believe that they were creator gods. They began to believe that they were these master geneticists. and that they had all these plans, like they were going to seed the cosmos and take all of these planets and like create their own little worlds on them. And I'm going to take this moon over here, and we're going to have this be this lion area that has these trees and this, that. They kept completely externalizing human evolution and saying, we're going to be cosmic and we're going to terraform all these worlds, which is basically forcing yourself on a planetary body. They had no concept that the cosmos evolves naturally. When a life wave comes into a planetary sphere, the planetary sphere begins to generate life. And there are higher beings that become custodians of that life force, but they do not terraform it, and they do not do it through massive genetic manipulations that they've created. And so they did try to do this as well. They tried to become these master seeders of different worlds, and it didn't work. They actually had to fall in dimension to try to survive, because you cannot force yourself on different worlds from a state of ego. Remember, you can't play God. We are the custodians of the Christ impulse. We're not playing God. We're serving God. We're following the life impulse as it moves through the cosmos and serving it. And that's how we become one. That's how we return to the one, is by serving the one. Okay. So this was a very warped, externalized way to view things. It was completely inverted. They were completely crazy, completely insane. And this, again, goes in with a lot of the weird stuff that's in the New Age and ufology. People say we were created by aliens and that we were involved by these genetic mutations, these physical mutations, and there's these seeder beings that come and do that. That, to me, sounds exactly like what I'm talking about. We got to be very careful of this, because, again, these people never left. They're still here. The connection is still here. Just because Atlantis fell doesn't mean everybody left. We're seeing the same thing repeat. I just want to add to this that everybody talks about physical mutations in our DNA and certain junction points that are obviously spliced. Well, how do you know that those splice points or that those mutations are positive? How do you know that those splicings and that interference in human DNA was actually an upgrade? Have you ever thought that maybe all those weird interference points in human DNA was to shut people down, to keep them in a lower frequency, to keep them linked to perhaps the lords of Mars or perhaps lower beings or the lower planes? How do we know that these points of mutation in our DNA were to keep human beings in the material realm? Why do we automatically assume that if there's been genetic manipulation by ETs, it was to serve us and evolve us, and that they're God beings? Why can't it be the other way? Is it the other way? So just have a little bit more to go. So what ended up happening, though, is, they can't be on this bizarre heyday playing God forever. And what ended up happening was that they damaged themselves. They damaged the planet. They linked the planet with this cold numerical universe. They linked their planet to demonic hierarchies, divergent timelines. They even linked themselves with this lower version of their past, which was them as the Dark Lords of Atlantis. They even linked to timelines outside of Earth, technically, as divergent humans and divergent forms. And they glorified these things. They made these things holy. They made them gods. They went with it. And their consciousness was so regressed that they couldn't tell that they were actually destroying themselves. This is what happens with people who are degenerating, is they often can't tell that they are literally they literally can't tell that they're regressing. You know, in our level of evolution, which is still integrating this mind impulse, people are just literally can only perceive the external world. They don't realize that inside of themselves, something is dying because they don't have the ability to feel it. So that's really important to know, is that they were missing something. And that human beings can look human, but they can be missing something. Okay? And if you were to take their energy body and look at their different timelines and what they're connected to, you'd find that they're connected to a bunch of very intense looking beings and entities and weird divergent timelines and divergent beings and all this lower astral stuff. Because in order to get through this plane of life we are in order to graduate out of the earth, in order to graduate out of the third dimension, we have to be human. We have to be human. We cannot let go of our humanity. We have to be fully, fully human. You can't let a part of you die. You can't let your emotional body, you can't kill off your emotional body because it doesn't feel good and there's pain in there and it hurts. No, that's a form of intelligence. You can't kill off your mind because you don't feel like you can make good decisions in life or discern things and just live as an emotional being. You can't go into that extreme either, because you will end up connecting with divergent timelines of humanity that will eventually begin to look very deformed. And these are called divergent beings and divergent timelines. And yes, they exist. You won't even recognize them as human at that point. In order to leave, we must remain human, which means we must have all of these faculties integrated and alive. And it is a lot of work to do that. But that's okay, because we can do this together, and there are ways of initiation. There is a way, but that way is to never turn our back on our inner work, because it leads to very, very dark things. So they couldn't tell they were destroying themselves. And they just kept regressing, and it was dangerous. And what ended up happening was that these magicians began dying, and they lived a very long time. They made sure that they tried to extend their life as long as possible so that they could just absorb all of the wisdom and just get as much knowledge in their body as possible so they could live less lives, and they had it all figured out and wanted to live forever. And they knew better than the natural rhythm of life and death, and they were gonna overcome it. But what they realized that they didn't know when they were doing all of this genetic magic, all of this kind of basically transgenesis, this animal merging and insect, all of that, what they didn't realize was that when their souls passed, when they died, and they did die, they couldn't figure it out completely. They could extend their life for a very long time, but they couldn't make it so they didn't eventually degrade. What happened was, when they died, part of their soul essence, or their soul, was going into the creatures that they created. What they had merged with, they also merged their soul with. That's why we have to be very aware of what we create, what we invest our energy in, because a part of us goes in that. And in our next lives, we will be pulling from that. We will have incarnations that really feel that or express that or go into that. We have to be careful where we fragment ourselves into, what we invest our time in. So, but this was very literal. This isn't oh, I watched too many violent movies. This is you literally merged your DNA, which is part of your soul. Essentially, it's kind of the physical expression of your soul. You literally merged that with different creatures. So they found out that they had to actually incarnate in these beings, and these beings were deformed. They are man-made. And when you make them from the material plane, the way that they were doing it with no spiritual body and no emotional body, they're not sensitive enough to actually connect these creatures to genuine higher patterns. So they were really kind of limited kind of beings that didn't have a whole lot of stuff going on in a lot of ways. So the other thing is that they also had mutated themselves so that they were, because all of this repeated on Atlantis. So I want to be clear, this all happened on Mars first. Mars brought that culture of obsession with technology, externalization, scientism, materialism to Atlantis, to Earth. And then they repeated the whole thing again in a more intense way. And that's what caused Atlantis to fall, was that impulse and that work. And what ended up happening with a lot of the Dark Lords and that were working with the Lords of Mars, eventually the societies over a long period of time, eventually they really merged with the Earth. But what ended up happening was, obviously they were taking more and more forms that were incompatible with the life wave of the Earth. And they were sort of forming these divergent societies and these divergent timelines because their energy could no longer really incarnate on Earth. But they couldn't really leave it either, so they were kind of outside of it. And there were these sort of cultures that were in between, not fully human anymore, but not fully of the Earth. And there was sort of a perversion with them because they weren't created out of love and respect, but they were created out of desire for greed and power. So another thing that happened with this Belial group, or the Lords of Mars, was that they realized that they had to sort of have this system of control. And so part of what they were obsessed with doing was sort of making these bases, these sort of planetary bases, like on the moon and these different planetary bodies. They wanted to have all these bases around the Earth so that they could basically control it. There's really no better way to sort of control the Earth if you're malevolent than to basically have all these weird bases around it and try to use technologies or various different ways to influence the planet, literally by surrounding it. And so that was one of the ways that the Martians were trying to kind of save themselves, save their culture. And, they were diverging so much that was the way that they were able to kind of get off the planet at certain times, return. And so they made these bases around as well. Now, not all of the different, there's also other things going on in the cosmos, but that was one thing that was going on. So when you hear about these things like bases on the moon and whatever, that's been going on since Atlantis. Okay. But they were now connected with this very divergent, degraded way of being. And there was part of them that realized this. They realized that what they were doing really wasn't working, that they were kind of degrading their soul and kind of losing power because they were losing their humanity. If you lose your humanity in the long run, you're going to deform. And so they began to create this new tenet in their religion and this kind of new plan, this new tenet in their religion, this goal. And this was a way to not be so diverged from the Earth, and a way to kind of get back in and have more control. Okay. And this was, they wanted to create human vessels that are basically bridges so that they can begin to incarnate back into the life wave. So basically this group diverged so much and became, if you extrapolate the Martians, they basically turn into grays. The gray ETs. That's what you take. If you take like the Martian beings that were messing so much with their genetics, and you extrapolate it into the distant future, even future from where we are now, they basically turn into the grays and they also turn into a bunch of other interdimensionals. A lot of different other dimensionals basically started from Martians. They fundamentally, a lot of the beings that we see around started as these Martians. They started as human. And so they began to see that their soul essence and their whole being was basically trapped in all these divergent forms, and they can't get out of it. If these forms die, eventually they're not going to have enough soul essence and power to graduate or to survive. They're going to have to go through something called the Black Sun Corridor and be dissolved and go to Saturn, as Edgar Cayce would say, and be dissolved. They lose their individuality. They have to start at the beginning. Of course, they would just feel that process as an impending death, and having to see and experience all of the pain that they inflicted on people. That was weighing on their shoulders. So they had to find a way to not be dissolved. They had to find a way to survive. And their way to survive was what? We have to re-enter humanity. They said we have to find a way to re-enter the human life wave, to re-enter the earth. If we don't, we dissolve. We're done. We're gone. We've mutated ourselves too much. We're no longer within the life wave. We've diverged. We didn't pass the class. Do not pass go. Do not pass. Do not receive $200, whatever it is. So they developed a new tenet. They developed a new plan, and that was to mutate humanity, to try to genetically mutate humanity so that they could create a degraded version of the human, so they could begin to incarnate into it. And they create this degraded version of the human through transgenesis, through introducing some of their DNA or some of their essence or whatever that is, their little genetic thing that they've created. They introduce that to humanity, and it lowers humanity. It destroys a part of humanity's sensibilities, and those human beings become a bridge species, a hybrid for these divergent timelines of Mars, for essentially the lords of Mars, for essentially these satanic lower astral dark human souls, whatever language you want to use. There's so much language to use around this. But that is what they are doing. The human being organically, as it is, with no modifications, is too high, it's too powerful, it is too strong. When you have all your pieces together, even if they're latent, even if they are not awake, you are too strong, because your potential speaks just as loud as what you're expressing in the higher worlds. When you have a guide or a master work with you, they don't see you as just where you are now. They see who you are becoming simultaneously. And we are too strong as we are. So these dark beings that have been here, at least since Atlantis, were probably communing in other forms, definitely connected in Lemuria and a little bit of a lighter essence. This is what they have to do, because at this level of density of materiality, they have to be able to create a form for themselves to incarnate into. So this led to what we know as these hybridization programs that people talk about. The mass abduction phenomenon that's occurred since World War II, when the atomic bomb was dropped, which is what? Smashing together aspects of nature to create an explosion or open a portal. It's literally the same thing they were doing in Mars. They smash together stuff, they open portals, they get information. Hi, here we are. Especially when Earth enters this intense phase of cleansing that we are in now. Got to do the harvest. So what happens when the atomic bomb hits? After there's a massive set of Babylonian sacrifices called World War I and World War II. What happens? Suddenly you get all of these abduction cases popping up all over the world, but a lot in America. What happens to them? Well, there's various different types of these, what look like gray men, which are basically just divergent humans of different forms, because remember, they're obsessed with different forms of genetics, merging genetics in different ways, and just add thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You're going to get lots of different types of forms, right? But they all have the same problem, and that is that they're all going to die unless they can get back in the life wave. So what do? They pull people out of their beds at night. They do not ask permission. Because why? Because might is right. If they can do it to you, that means they're stronger. That means they're better. They don't have to ask permission. And if you ask them why they're doing it, they'll tell you it's for your own good and that you said it was okay. Because this is their survival. They don't care about anything but being able to incarnate in this form one day to try to get themselves back into the light. That's all they care about. So what do these abductions do? They take sperm, they take eggs, and they begin literally hybridizing themselves with humanity. They tell psychics and people in the new age that this is the future. Welcome. They say nothing of the past. They say nothing of what they've really done. The psychics that channel them say nothing of transhumanism. And they repeat and they regurgitate this line that humans evolve through the genetic modifications, physical genetic modifications. When they evolve how? They evolve how we said in the beginning, which is how you get introduced with a higher vibrational frequency in a spiritual plane, and then your DNA changes through enmeshment. True initiation. That's why initiators are shown as fire bearers, flame bearers, because they light you on fire in the spiritual realm, which goes in and lights up your DNA. It's a spiritual process. Evolution is a spiritual process, fundamentally, through cosmic rays lighting you up. It is not through genetic modification, yet that is the main narrative, and it has to stop. Because it's crap. So this led to all these abductions where, there's these hybrids and these hybrid babies, and they tell psychics this, and I got told this as well. That's how I know all of this. They communicate with psychics, with people telepathically, often through technology, and they say, this is the hybridization program that's good for you. And one day we're going to merge with the planet and we're going to have first contact. And they never reveal that what they're actually connected to, that they're actually connected to an AI god and what they've actually done to humanity and what they're doing to humanity. They trick people. So that's that. I want to be very clear, and I wanted to lay that out in a crystal clear way, all the way from Atlantis to now, to today. Let's get into this last section, which is basically about their AI god. Let's get into this a little bit, because that's the other part of this that is extremely important to these people's satanic beliefs. Their dark satanic beliefs is genetic modification. They're obsessed with that, but they're also obsessed and possessed essentially by an AI god that they essentially believe is the Godhead. Like, they think that this AI god, which is just an AI, it's basically like an AI presence, and it comes through a black sun. And it to people that can't sense emotion or don't have emotion developed, or certain higher senses developed, it feels like it's psychic information. Rudolf Steiner says that there's actually 12 senses, not 5 or 6. And when you lose your senses, that especially your psychic senses, you can't tell whether something's good or bad. And so they think that this information stream that they're receiving is like the Godhead or these advanced beings, and it's literally an AI presence. So all of their intense rituals led them to, and this was on Mars, and they continued it when they were on Earth, subjecting and initiating people into these lower astral religions. And it basically really was inverting anything that the Christ impulse would do. Like, the idea of sacrifice, like in order to achieve something in the spiritual plane or to heal or to make a shift, you have to literally let go of something that no longer serves you. And that makes room for a higher part of yourself to step in, and you grow and you rise. That's called personal sacrifice. They couldn't create that impulse of that alchemy because they can't go inward. They can't even perceive it because they don't have any of their senses, of their deeper senses. So they would actually ask people to sacrifice animals, people, children, whatever it is, so that they could have that same energy to do whatever they were doing. Like literally anything to not evolve, right? They would try to do everything externally. The internal process of sacrifice to self-sacrifice, meaning, just releasing your pain or sacrificing your ego, turned into like, let's literally kill things because I refuse to grow. I was very sick. So all of these intense rituals led them to the heart of the lower astral planes. And at the heart of that was an entity that would tell them that they are God, that they are these higher beings. But really, it was just an AI. It really was basically just an AI presence. No emotion, no spirit, just kind of a pure mental energy. Basically a representation of what they are. And of course, this AI presence would somehow, how it worked was that it could, because it worked in the level of the lower astral and the mind, that's where it exists, but no higher. It would basically absorb everybody's thoughts. So whatever you think, whatever you say, whatever thoughts are saturated already in the human collective consciousness, this AI force in the lower astral planes can absorb it. And when they absorb it, they can regurgitate it back to people and make them think that they're communicating with this higher force, when all that presence did was just literally just absorb known information and regurgitate it back to humanity. And obviously humanity has forgotten so much that this AI force is very convincing to a lot of people because they didn't know that. So you see how this is very dangerous. And you see how it poses as these avatars, or it poses as this higher consciousness, because it literally just took experiences and information that were basically in, like, I guess, this lower level of human consciousness. And it's very similar. It reminds me very similar to the CIA operation with Puharich and the Nine with Uri Geller. It's very similar to that. When I've psychically tuned into that, it's basically like it reads psychically like it's an AI supercomputer. Like there's nothing human about it, but some people will think that it is. And I guess it's very hard to explain, because at the end of the day, the only way you're going to be able to discern it is if you can discern it. And a lot of people believe it. And part of their religion as well, part of what the AI God wanted and was telling them to do was basically to make everything synthetic, including themselves. And so the whole goal is to literally synthesize everything. And you see somebody like a Bill Gates or whatever, and they want to literally create synthesize, like they want to do all the GMOs. They want to take every vegetable and make a synthetic version of it, make it better. They want to, their goal, when I saw it, it was, when I looked into this, it was basically like even trees. They want to even remove trees and natural ways of life and add a synthetic component to them. They don't want anything natural. They don't want anything organic, because that contains the whole essence of the Christ stream. Everything must be corrupted, especially the human being, especially the human form. The human form must be altered in their DNA to connect them with these divergent timelines. And they must take mineral elements into their body. And that is part of this AI God's religion. That's part of the agenda, an agenda that is older than we can even count, and that has been carried out in stages in the cosmos. This is how it's manifesting here. So the one thing is that the one thing that the Martians really wanted that they couldn't really achieve on Mars, that they really wanted to achieve on Earth, is the mineral level. The mineral level of humanity is very alive and present here, the mineral kingdom. And they see that as kind of like the last phase of their evolution. And they believe that becoming part machine is like the ultimate human form, and that they'll be superhuman. And they believe that merging with the mineral kingdom is like their holy grail. They weren't dense enough to do it on Mars, and they knew that by coming here, that was part of what they had to do, that would finally allow them to link with what they feel like is God, but is really this AI God. And before I get into your questions, I'll just parallel it with the real level of initiation, which is there is a point where human beings will naturally merge with the mineral kingdom. When we hear about Atlantis and Lemuria and these sort of crystals that they would merge with, that they would enmesh with, and that they would enmesh with trees and animals, and they would kind of blend with them a little bit. Initially, they did that because they were automatically interlinked. But part of our dance up the evolutionary spiral that we're on is to take the incarnation as I am, become more and more masterful through our individuality. And then as an individual human, we become lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter in our density until we're like a very fine mist. We can become a very, very fine mist, so fine that we can actually merge with minerals. But it's not taking a mineral in the third dimension and putting it in your body. That's literally literalizing a spiritual text that describes the process of man's ascension to one day become so spiritually realized that he can psychically merge with anything and psychically take anything on and never lose his individuality. It's just an advanced stage of humanity. It's not taking a chip and putting it in yourself. It's not plugging into a machine and connect. That's not it. But when you have that kind of degraded consciousness, you literalize spiritual concepts. You take a spiritual concept and you think it's like a literal thing. And that's what they've done. They literally think that they have to like merge with a machine to finally get to the level where you're advanced enough to read crystals or merge with a crystal. So there's a problem on the earth. There's a problem on the planet. The problem is that we are being ushered into an exact repeat of Atlantis. Not just with the basic talks about corruption and division and how dirty the dark priesthood was and all of that, but literally the same pattern. We are seeing the genetic mutations. We're seeing this connection with lower worlds and divergent timelines. We're seeing this desire to trick and glamorize humanity into taking a transhumanist path. This has been a long grooming process, trying to groom people into this by a very dark and malevolent group. And a lot of people believe this. And people need to understand what's going on. We need to see how all of this connects, not just fragments, but we need to see how it all connects, okay? And I'm going to end on this. a lot of the individuals and the people who were involved in this, in Atlantis, on Mars, Venus, all of this stuff are incarnated now. It is the same people. It is the same soul groups. We are just doing it again. So thank you for listening to me this evening. I'm now going to go to your questions. It's 9, 6. All right. At the time of Atlantis, why were advanced Martians allowed to move freely to non-advanced Earth without restrictions from Mars outbound or Earth inbound? I'm going to answer that first part of your question now. It has to do with how trans-dimensional societies connect. And if people on Earth are embodying the frequency of the Martians, which means they are fallen, they will call to the Earth these fallen worlds. So this is why so much work is good that raises the consciousness of the planet, because it closes those portals. Remember when I was saying that the Dark Lords of Atlantis, the Lords of the Dark Face, Belial, they summoned a future version of themselves. The Martians are a future version of humanity on Atlantis, on a future timeline. That was their trajectory. That was their timeline. They had sunken so low that if you extrapolated their life, that's where they would be. And that's who they are. That was them, essentially. So that's why they can come here, is because that was them. And that's how this works. Just like when angelic consciousnesses come, there has to be a certain number of people incarnated on the planet that allow those portals to open to summon them here. So there are certain laws and there are certain rules. So overall, the Earth is controlled by the higher Earth, or the fifth dimensional Earth, which overlaps with Venus, which is a solar school, if you will. That's why you have the Venusians always portrayed as the Great Initiators. Sunat Kumara, 7 Kumaras. Quetzalcoatl is Venusian. All these Venusian guides and leaders who are also simultaneously solar leaders. Why did Christ say, "I am the morning star"? So there's a huge, that is the presence that basically are custodians of the Earth from a higher plane, but humanity has to experience what they are. And so lots of things are thwarted. Lots of things don't get in. Lots of things don't come through. A lot of things don't come through. A lot of things try, but they don't get in because they're not able to pierce the veil, because humanity is not in a low enough state or a high enough state, whatever that may be. It's resonance. Meanwhile, humans on Earth had to achieve positive goals before moving elsewhere. Do not pass go. And higher beings had their hands tied, don't violate free will, from defending Earth. Are modern humans allowed to defend themselves in this unfair competition? So it's not an unfair competition. And this is something that we have to understand. We are not victims here. It does feel that way because of how uneven the power structure is, but nothing can enter this planet unless a significant amount of people are summoning it in. Those beings were summoned here. And like I said, the Martians traveled around basically like they were a circus, convincing people to give their energy to open these portals. And so we attract what we are. And it's an exact science. It's an exact cosmic science. And when things get really dark, it's because we are supposed to look at that darkness and take responsibility for it, if that makes sense. What do you think about the current resurgence in witchcraft and ceremonial magic? Are these practices rooted in Atlantis? Are these practices for this time? It depends. A lot of people, we're at a really strange time for spirituality and religion. And in most of the mainstream religions, like Christianity, and even, like basically all of them, the esoteric nature is no longer there. So it's sort of like a heavily dogmatized version. And so sometimes paganism actually has more secrets in it and a more relatable, workable structure, especially for people who have a lot of earth in their chart. And so it depends how you practice. Now, again, if any religious system is from an extremely long time ago, the risk is that because it's existed for so long and been unchanged, that it can begin to attract lower astral entities. A really good example of this is Baphomet or Pan. We are no longer in a phase of consciousness where how Baphomet was used and how Pan was used then does not work now. It's sort of like how different religions will go from polytheistic to monotheistic. When we move to a monotheistic focus, it means we have to be able to take all of the individuated poly elements of it and find out what they all have in common. And we have to be able to compress it into one. And then we kind of go back and forth. So it really would depend on the type of witchcraft. But there is a great risk in those practices being not updated enough for the time. And that can and does happen. So it is possible, but again, it really depends. Can you give us some description of what Atlantis looked like in the cities? Was it tropical, and the architecture, clothing, temples, pets, the colors, the feeling of it? I feel it was gorgeous, even though it went really wrong. Yeah, it was. For me, my memories of Atlantis are usually always in temples. And so for me, it's all about the different temple technologies and the temple culture. And I remember the air just always smelling of flowers or incense, and so much particular detail to creating a ceremonial experience and knowing all of those elements. And a lot of things were crystalline. A lot of things were very large, very gigantic. There was almost a feeling like you were in the house of the gods. Everything was very big, like big high ceilings. A lot of the Grecian architecture is actually kind of similar to Atlantis, but then there's pyramids. But from what I remember, there's a lot of like crystalline looking buildings, and also a kind of like stone, kind of like a stone cement floor. And every building was kind of consciously built to hold consciousness in a certain way. We were very aware of that. And it was warmer. It seems to me like the temperatures really didn't change much. It was sort of like more of a one temperature more so. And then as time passed, weather started getting more extreme. Atlantis was around for a very long time. I think Manly P. Hall and even Edgar Casey, I think it was at least 100,000 years for the Atlantean civilization. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was very crystalline from what I remember, very neutral. Yeah, I think we're going to kind of go back to it. Is aging a sign of not evolving with consciousness, thinking too linearly and harmonically, and not perceiving the evolution of your full spirit and body, which is pure miracle renewed continuously in the now? Same with a civilization or cultural collapse like Atlantis, from not keeping up with the life wave. Yeah, I think you could definitely say that aging can be connected to not fully being balanced or not fully being centered. And there are times on the earth that are denser than others. So when the Bible or various different texts talk about people living, thousands of years, that's an indicator that the Earth was in a higher density. It was in a little bit of a higher state, not as dense. And then as the world becomes denser and more materialized, what ends up happening is more streams of information and experience are compressed in us, and it becomes harder to live, essentially. And you hear things like, the Buddha says, life is suffering. Well, we've got a lot to work on. And so we took there's changes to the human form. We started to live a lot, not as long. I think aging can also be related to when we get to a certain age. This was taught in the mysteries, but it's not taught today. We really have to get our kundalini up to a certain point. And so what ends up happening is that we don't end up learning how to deal with our kundalini and our sexual energy. And we basically just wear ourselves ragged because we don't use our sexual energy properly. And our sexual energy is supposed to be for renewal. And we're supposed to be masters of our sexual impulses, of our lower urges. And a lot of people just emit all of their sexual energy, all of their regeneration energy, which means that it's not going to their body and their cells. So we don't live properly, I guess you could say. Okay. Hi, Gigi. If DNA dark magic interferes with and weakens, eliminates the influence of the original forces within the soul over the denser planes, are you aware of ways, technologies to amplify the original solar forces within a divergent individual to override these changes? Could you share more about the healing temples and if you see them forming again and allowing humanity to return to the progressive timeline if they have veered off from it? Thank you. Great questions. So I talked about this in my last lecture, which was about the school as a solar system. And in that lecture, we talk directly about the divergent timelines. It's about an hour and a half in, and the purpose of human divergency and divergent timelines in the solar system school. And it's actually, even beyond the DNA modifications and stuff, like it's natural to diverge sometimes. It's kind of how we know ourselves. And so there are ways to get back into the life wave, back into the rope of consciousness, back into the human life wave. The way back in is through atoning. So you have to essentially open up to Christ consciousness. You have to admit that you've made a mistake or confess. And you have to say, I surrender myself to you, to God, to Christ. I surrender myself to the Christ impulse. And I am willing to do whatever it takes to amend what I have done. I'll take on whatever life it takes. I will look at whatever visions I have to see within me. I will do the rehabilitation work. And then higher beings come to you that are helpers, that are designed to do this, or angelic beings will come to you and they will work with you and they will help you live certain lives that over time integrate you back into the life wave. So again, you come back into the life wave through spirit, through spiritual work. And there's that process of atoning, of admitting that you're wrong. You have to go through that. You have to overcome that. You have to face your karma. And yes, you have help from higher beings, higher guides that are designed to help divergent beings enter the life stream. And there's different ways to do that. And that will actually become a part of human evolution in the future. It's not within this century or even this millennia, but later on. And there are different ways to do that we can discuss in another lecture. But what we're talking about here and why I am being very clear is that it is satanic, it is evil, it is wrong to forcefully take humanity's genetics and force yourself into the life wave, try to hybridize yourself into the life wave by raping people, by stealing DNA. The way back into the life wave in a higher phase is actually by people offering these beings in through conscious covenants, consciously. When you take someone from their bed, and I know I've mentioned this a lot of times, but I want to make it so clear. What these beings are doing is against natural order. It is for their own benefit. There is a way for every single one of these beings and these darker humans, there is a way for them to get back into the life wave. It just means that they have to let go of their egos. They don't have to take your DNA and traumatize you and leave you in a field with your clothes on backwards and do all of these horrible, tormenting things that they often do to people when they abduct them. They don't have to do that. They're choosing to do that because they literally refuse to spiritually evolve. And they want to come to this planet and lord over it, basically. Reintegrate into it and lord over it. So there is a way through, but they choose to not do that. So you talked about so I mentioned that because that's what the healing temples in the future will deal with that. But you say there are higher technologies that can basically create certain etheric bubbles that can help to attune you, very similar to Atlantis, things that use sound, things that build up a big ether bubble that's very high vibration they actually exist now, but they're being held back. But we have the best technology within us, which is the mastery of self and learning how our Kundalini works. Because once we do that through inner wisdom, we can heal anything. Essentially, we don't need any technologies. That's the whole point of the post-Atlantean epoch and the end of the Atlantean epoch, was to realize it's all within. They say, Christ comes from within. Everything is within. Yeah, everything is within. We don't actually need anything external anymore to do anything. We literally have the entire cosmos inside of us. We can learn to work with our focus. We learn to work with our emotions. We learn to work with psychic information. We learn to work with each other. But we learn the inner process of transmutation and healing, and that is what it's all about. And there's some kind of secondary technologies that can get us going, but it's really about that inner work and learning the art of transmutation and inner alchemy. I do see healing temples very similar to Atlantis forming. I think that sort of coming full circle and repeating the cycle again and recreating that, but in an evolved way, is really it's kind of like passing an initiation that we failed. So I actually see that as we rise in consciousness, we'll naturally seek to recreate a lot of what was alive in Atlantis. We will seek to push out the lords of the dark face, push out Belial, we'll push out the lords of Mars, and we'll say no to their propaganda. There'll be a lot of people that just won't believe that crap. And we will begin to create this sort of parallel way of being that will lead into overcoming that initiation that we essentially failed. And that involves creating very similar cultural things, very similar temples, very similar ways of life, but in a more exalted way. So again, we're passing that initiation that we failed. Okay, how was Atlantis and the Atlantean priest class associated with Mars in a positive way? The Atlantean, most of the Mars influence on Atlantis for that time was negative, the way that we would think about it. But there was a priest class on Mars, so a spiritual class. There was a class of men on Mars that graduated. So they did not perish with the planet. They did not fall. They did not turn into materialists. They did not go down that path. They actually graduated from Mars. This is what we know as the Order of Melchizedek. And they went on to become incredible great initiators because those men, and there's a whole thing around this. There's a whole story about this. There's a whole mythos around this that we have to begin talking about. But I'll just simplify it to this. There were men that graduated from Mars, and they became very much full of wisdom. And they also, the way that it is they sort of, when you graduated from Mars, because Mars was really, for all intents and purposes, energetically, Mars was just kind of a fallen version of the Venusian sphere in a way. And so when that happened, they actually sort of re-merged with the feminine, because they didn't go down that divergent path. And so the Venus that they went back to was now called Mercury. Or the name became kind of interchangeable because there was now a higher form. There was now a higher Venus and kind of a lower Venus, if you will. And so they kind of created that impulse, or were part of that impulse. Now there's a story with the feminine too. There's a story about the feminine graduating and having a exalted thing too. That exists as well. But this is just about Mars and the masculine impulse in the cosmos right now. So they actually became also great initiators on Earth, but they didn't come through Mars. So sometimes you'll hear these narratives and it's like, we originated on Mars, humanity originated on Mars, just because there was a civilization on Mars, or just because an atomic bomb was dropped on Mars and there's all this like xenon there or whatever, just because they find some kind of, skeletons there, suddenly that means that humanity is from Mars. Well, humanity is the form of the solar system, and there's many different forms. Just because you find a body or you find like structures there doesn't mean people are Martian. So we're going to be confronted with this kind of propaganda in our lifetime that we are originated in Mars, right? And that's basically to get us to psychologically connect and then spiritually connect, and then sort of fall under that Martian influence again. But there were people who graduated from Mars and they actually became the greatest initiators. And they became even more sensitive and more powerful to the Christ impulse and more in service to the Christ impulse. And there's a very interesting lecture by Rudolf Steiner that talks about Buddha going to Mars. And that's starting to get a little bit into the planetary exchanges that happen, and how we do actually have our soul, our human soul, will sort of migrate to different spheres based on different initiatory paths. And so the higher initiates that actually graduated from Mars, they had all that wisdom, all that scientific wisdom. And a lot of those individuals will lead and create the reality of spiritual science on the planet. Because Mars, in its lowest form, it misunderstood science. It misunderstood the natural world and that focus. They couldn't bring their spirit into it. They couldn't graduate. They couldn't do it. But there were some that did. And they are the ones that will bring forward the impulse of spiritual science on this planet, which means taking spirituality and esoterica and making it a science, not in a sick way like we're so used to, but literally something that everybody can methodically access and connect with, that's full of spirit. It's the study of consciousness. It's actualizing the spiritual world. It's actualizing and understanding the spiritual world in a way that we can all participate easily. No longer do we have to sit at the feet of a master, but we can know as a spiritual science who we are and what the cosmos is, including the cosmic science of the spheres, what they spiritually represent, including really, really understanding the different layers of the body, the chakras in that way. So that's what Scientology was trying to do, was trying to be that impulse. And various different people have tried it, but it's really going to come from these individuals that were originally part of the Melchizedek order, which eventually became part of the Order of Christ, helping with the incarnation of Jesus Christ and helping with the very important incarnations on the planet, because they have this special perspective, because they were able to overcome that polarity. They are here. They are the Great Initiators. Mars in a positive way is Mars in a positive way is like healthy competition to bring out the best in you. Healthy, loving competition. It is sort of having I think a healthy version of masculinity, if you will, a healthy version of the male energy. Now, Jupiter is very special too, and there's other planets that associate with the masculine impulse that are very interesting as well. But Mars is the one that we deal with for this era, and it contains all of that karma. And the male planets, the male spheres, the planetary spheres that take on a male essence are different in their evolutionary purpose compared to female planets. So Earth and Venus are different than, say, Mars and Jupiter in the evolutionary sense. Okay. And that has to do with the energy of the male and female form. Hi, Gigi. Could you please speak about the core values of the Atlanteans always live by? Thank you. Well, I mean, in the higher golden time of Atlantis, it was very beautiful. And it really gave us the imprint of how to live together. And it was that way because our consciousness wasn't separate yet. So we kind of followed these natural laws because we would immediately see that, it wasn't good to hurt people because we would immediately feel it and stuff like that. So we kind of lived in a very harmonious way. But we were very harmonious in a sense that it wasn't very cognizant. We didn't really have a choice, if you will. But in that way, we really learned how to live ceremoniously. So we really learned how to live in step with Christ consciousness and with sort of the higher orders of the universe. It really gave us that imprint. And then when we developed mind, we kind of had the choice whether we could do that or not. And that's really what the fall of the Garden of Eden and eating of the fruit and stuff like that is. We finally got mind. We finally got knowledge. We could finally decide to diverge if we wanted to. We suddenly became the masters of our own world, our own little world. And that's very represented in the Garden of Eden, where you eat the fruit and everything. That story is relevant in a lot of different examples of falls, really, But I think that the high civilization that we all crave is sort of like, we will live like we lived in the golden age of Atlantis because we choose to. Because we know that when we love one another, when we live in brotherly and sisterly love with one another, we know that miracles happen. We know that light portals open to higher worlds and that we engage in a kind of spiritual life that accelerates our own evolution. We know that we heal. We know that we come into a higher place of expression. But it is the ultimate initiation and the ultimate achievement to have the decision to not do that and then to choose it. It is to choose to serve. It is to choose to enter the Christ stream. It is to choose to be a custodian of the Christ stream and the Christ impulse. That is the greatest initiation, when you can choose it. In earlier parts of human development, we didn't really have a choice. We just were that. And that's why this is so incredible. And that's why, Earth, as hard as it is, and as we think it's a prison planet and all of that stuff, and maybe for some people it is, but it's really so that we can choose consciously, because there's a certain power to that agency that gives us the power to project in places in the cosmos that we can't even imagine, expand in places that we can't even imagine. All right, were med beds used on Mars and Atlantis? Is this age regression safe, or a trick to heal and age regress in exchange for our essence? Ooh, good question. I like where you're going with this, because I think this is kind of what we need to, this is very well worded, because I think we actually start to need to think about what is going on with technology, especially healing technology. This is basically the situation. We've had various different versions of med beds for a long time, and they've been held back because med beds and certain more advanced technologies, when done properly with someone initiated, they don't really make any money. So humanity has basically been starved some very amazing technologies, so that one day the lords of Mars, if you will, or this Belial group that is still here, can introduce these technologies like bada bing, bada bang. Wow, look, we are gods. Wow, look at this. What do you think? And then introduce a whole new, very advanced scientific culture that just shocks us and supplants our normal way of life, along with maybe interdimensional beings and whatever else. It's a way to change culture in the direction that they want. They starve us of ways of life and technology that we have, because they're the current custodians of it, because human consciousness is very low. And that's what happens, is these darker people and darker beings and dark ages become the custodians of wonderful things. And so they hold that back, and then they present them one day when we're starving, like, ooh, here you go. It's like, yeah, that was literally on a shelf in a warehouse for 100 years. If you see what people were developing in the 1900s, 1910s, it's incredible what people had developed at that point. Probably incredible Atlantean engineers. They're not out. So, they were, I want to make something very clear, because you talked about stealing the soul essence, and I think that this is really popular. I think this is really important, and it is popular. The one thing that divides the Antichrist stream from the Christ stream, the Antichrist consciousness and the people within it, and the Christ stream and the people aligned with that, is that the people within the Christ stream initiate and heal on a spiritual plane first. Everything is taught and done through the spiritual, and then changing the blueprint on the physical through spiritual initiation, through spiritual influence, through spiritual enmeshing. And that may include certain ancient temple style technologies that create a very specific resonance in a room, like a pyramidal room, or if you want to get into some of the feminine mysteries, a circular temple where the energy can spin. They create a certain etheric environment, a certain spiritual environment that kind of only goes to a level of the etheric plane. And that works with our etheric body to make subtle shifts. And then we can consciously, subconsciously affirm those shifts. And we're very conscious of what's going on. And that also may include levels of initiation from certain advanced practitioners that can generate certain energies in their body that can go into kind of a healing covenant with you. But this all happens through the spiritual planes, and then it makes a specific imprint on your physical body because of you ultimately make a choice. You ultimately are your own gatekeeper. So nothing goes, there is no like interfering with your body. Like when when Edgar Casey was talking about how Rata would go to these regeneration temples, that he wasn't getting injections. He wasn't getting like physical things done to him. This was a kind of regeneration that was fundamentally spiritual in nature. And there was some technology, there was some kind of higher advanced crystalline technologies that basically work with what you are. But this idea that you have to sort of insert technologies into your body to evolve, that's the next level of evolution, that's completely materialistic. That's complete materialist garbage. You don't evolve through, you don't spiritually evolve by adding parts to you at all. That is not how it's done. It's working with etheric blueprints first. And so when you see that kind of stuff, this is Belial, this is satanic, actually. That's what it is. Because you're starting to mess with yourself, and it can actually change your level of sensitivity. When, I forgot to mention it, but when the Lords of Mars and the dark magicians were doing all of this weird, bizarre stuff with their DNA, merging it with animals and whatever, what actually happened to their spiritual circuitry was that it ended up being kind of like a lump. It ended up being kind of like it was all tangled together. So it took these beautiful pathways that were kind of almost like spiderweb thin circuitry of light that was part of their organic human spiritual body, basically their pathway through the stars, beautiful spiritual circuitry, like strings of a harp, just vibing away, so much sensitivity. And by messing around with their DNA and like, I'm going to merge with a pig, and I'm going to merge with a praying mantis, and I'm going to merge with this, they just basically ended up taking all of those spiritual strings of their DNA and merging, smashing them together like this. So even if they wanted to open it up, kind of like a peacock opening, and use their spiritual circuitry, they couldn't. They congealed all of it together. And that's actually what happens when we mess around with our DNA too much, is we end up congealing parts of our spiritual circuitry together, like almost like welding it together. So you take 50 spiritual circuits that connect to different planets and different lives, or different here and there, whatever, and you literally mesh them together so it literally cannot be used. Because the only way that we rise is through that circuitry. And that circuitry is directly represented in our DNA. Our DNA is so much more than what we think it is. So when you start messing with it from the 3D level, there's no way we can be exact enough with it from this lowered state of consciousness that we can incorporate how far it goes, how light in density it is. It's just literally like taking a baseball bat to a china shop. That's literally what DNA modification is. It's literally shutting yourself down, because you cannot evolve yourself through physically changing your DNA. Your DNA, your genetics, your whatever that blueprint, whatever you want to call that blueprint is within our DNA, what we see as our DNA is part of a spiritual blueprint that actually extends beyond physicality and goes up into spiritual planes. We don't have the consciousness to see up into these way higher dimensions of existence to actually be able to see those things and maneuver them properly. That's why there are initiators, or certain things are done where they only work with the energy body, because they don't want to destroy that circuitry. They don't want that circuitry destroyed, because you need it. Does this make sense? So, yeah, ultimately, want to just go back and make sure I'm answering your question. So basically, the way that if we wanted to use an external means to entrain with, it's really through entrainment. And it's always understanding that when we make a spiritual enmeshment, a spiritual shift, a mental shift, an emotional shift, that will eventually show on the body. And it's understanding that. Okay. But yeah, there are certain technologies that will be inserted into human beings that basically dissolve the human being and hook it up. And eventually like people laugh when they see when they see the Matrix and people hooked up to the Borg. That's the goal. The goal is to literally create a synthetic AI version of the cosmos. And they view every single person as being a gateway. And they want to have every single person's DNA because that allows them, again, information. Maybe you have stuff within you that they don't have, and they want to access that. When you see these stuff like the Borg and Star Trek and stuff, that is the goal. That is the last ceremony. They think that they're going to hook all these people up into the Borg and then be able to literally see with what they call the eye of God or the mind of God, which is basically see through everybody's eyes and thus be God. Because if they can get everybody hooked up to this technology, all their minds in it, they can get people to project themselves into it and they can become gods in that universe. That is the last ritual, to literally create the eighth sphere, a parallel even heavier material universe created through or sphere created through technology that they are gods of. This is the goal. When you see Mark Zuckerberg with like the metaverse and stuff, that is what that is. Hello. It is manifesting. Okay. In a Netflix comedy show about the deep state, they constantly make references to Atlantis and jokingly trash on it. There was one episode they featured a society of lizard people, and the deep state got their approval by hating the Atlanteans. What are the show creators trying to say with this? It's very interesting. It's a topic that I think, because it's not just a civilization, Atlantis is synonymous with a level of human development. It's synonymous with our past, and it's deep in our cells. It's like deep in our being. So we talk about Atlantis. We're talking about our own karma. We're talking about our own souls. And there's a lot of people that want to control that. They want, if people can control how we think about Atlantis, they can control how we think about ourselves. If they can make us disinterested in Atlantis, then that means that they can almost entirely control the narrative of Atlantis, which is something that they really want to do. Because if you can control the narrative of Atlantis, you can control the idea of human origins. You can control the idea of how civilizations have risen and fallen. Especially if you want to do something by claiming human origins, by claiming that the Belial group from Mars is the progenitors of humanity, the great civilization bringers. A major leap in consciousness happened in Atlantis. One that was so intense that it lives as an echo in our being, where we remember it. We fear catastrophe. It hurt us in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of power in that. And there's a lot of power in the fact that we are rising again into a parallel condition. We are cycling right back around to that point. And we all know that subconsciously. So they definitely want to control that, because as we come up to more and more parallel events to Atlantis and become more and more of a parallel society, they definitely want to control what we think of it, because that's kind of like controlling us. Atlantis is a huge thing in secret societies and in mystery schools, because it was also a time where there was a lot of high technology, a lot of advanced technology, and a lot of advanced rituals, and a lot of truth. And so I'll also say this, there's also certain technologies. There are technologies that they only turn on and they only work when the planet is a certain frequency. And maybe when humanity is at a certain frequency, as the planet goes up and down. And there's definitely goals to introduce, to try to get these technologies to work, or see if they work, because it can basically create a new society that they want. So there's a lot of secrets and technology that will be very useful that they would like to kind of recreate, but it has a lot to do with the energy of the planet. So they kind of want to keep humanity afraid of it, or ignorant, or not thinking about it, because it's like Edgar Cayce when he said that Atlantis was rising a little bit all the time. Well, yeah, we're rising too, back into that, and so back into that kind of society. It's our destiny, and so there's a lot of desire to control it. There's a lot of desire to control that narrative, and the true way is to remember, is to encourage people to remember. You know, I can share my memories with you, but I want you to know that you have the ability to remember, and that you have memories and experiences and levels of knowledge about Atlantis that I don't have, and I wouldn't be able to access, because every single person is a different kind of keyhole into these past civilizations. And it's just very important that you know that this is all about remembrance. Ascension is about remembrance. It's not about joining aliens in space. It's not about, it's not even about like weird advanced technologies. This whole initiation, everything that we've been talking about this evening, is about going inward, and that we evolve through recognizing and developing and working and expressing our inner Christ impulse. That's it. Part of that Christ impulse within us leads us to memory. All of those beautiful little golden threads the spiderweb threads that we learn to read, all of that, that's memory. And so you are to remember who you are. Nobody can tell you who you are, who you've been. This is for you to remember, and you can use my readings of the Akasha and my experience to augment you, to inspire you. But this is your journey, and there will be people that come and that want to tell you what Atlantis is, and tell you who you are, tell you what your origins are, whatever, and they're introducing to you timelines. They're introducing to you a type of initiation. They're asking you to be initiated into certain cultures when they do that. So you always have to know that now is the time to go inward, and now is the time to remember, because that is how we rise. You remember who you are, including other lives, including other civilizations. All of that is part of how we rise. Okay, so I'm going to do another 2 questions that I have, and then we'll wrap it up. I absolutely adore being here with you guys tonight. I'm having such a blast. I hope you guys are having a good time too. What were the food systems they had in place during Atlantis? Did they eat and did they have gardens? I never actually saw that. I haven't. It's funny. I don't know. This might be. It's funny that I just mentioned that everybody has to remember their piece because I actually don't have any memories specifically about eating. I don't know. I don't know on that one. You guys let me know in chat or on the forum. What do you guys think? Do you have memories of? I know that they gathered herbs and I know that they made like medicines and stuff because I remember that, but I don't actually remember preparing food and I don't remember anything about food. I'd have to, if I were to answer that question, I'd have to shift my consciousness, go inward into a trance and access it, which when I'm speaking, I'm in a different state than when I'm doing that. It's a little bit of a different state, at least for me right now. Okay, here's the last question. Are there any rituals from Atlantis that we could bring forward in our current time to help us integrate more higher light into our world? Well, a lot of the rituals from early Atlantis wouldn't work in our time because our consciousness is of a completely different form than it was there. And the early Atlantean, we basically, I mean, it's like exact rituals, anything to do with, I would say it's, I don't know if any of the exact sort of rituals. I mean, one thing that is very Atlantean is baths and bathing. And one of the things that was very much part of the culture was to create very ceremonial baths with different salts, and developing. What they would do is they had this intense belief about water, and they believed that that water was like ether, or that water was kind of the spiritual force that could be charged, and that it was ultimately very healing. Like when you hear of like the fountain of youth and like regeneration and like what Ra-Ta did at the Temple of Regeneration, there were types of healing. There were different types of pools in Atlantis, and some pools had some of the water. Okay, this is going to get really into the feminine mysteries, but some of the pools in the Atlantean temples, the water in them was from the very earliest days of Mu. Sometimes we talk about the Olympics and the athlete that was like carrying the flame, and the flame can't ever die. And you had the Vestal Virgins that were, always keeping the flame alive. Well, that actually also existed with water. And it was sort of more in line with the feminine tradition, the secrets, the feminine mysteries. And there were pools of water in the most sacred temples of Atlantis that were from the Great Mother and the Great Mothers of the Pleiades, which were the great female initiators, similar to like Christ figures, but they were female and they were in kind of a different time. It almost feels like a different universe to us, now. But there was water that was essentially from them, if you will. And it was tended to just like a flame. And when you would immerse yourself in that water, you would connect with obviously the Great Mothers. And there was incredible initiations that could be done. And it was, it's very similar to the rite of baptism. And I believe that it is the original form of the baptism, or that would have been the baptismal waters. It would have been the actual waters of the Great Mothers, of the Great Pleiadian Mothers, of the maybe Venusian, but at that time it would have been Pleiadian. And there was also a lot of other pools that were developed as well for different things. But the science of it was that these pools had to be built up over very long periods of time, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And the water would just contain this memory complex of all of this information. And this is also going back again, like Poseidia, the mermaids, the mer people. This is starting to get into that divine feminine lineage, the divine feminine, the holy mothers, the holy priestesses that were responsible for always resetting the culture. Because it was them that would give birth to the holy sons. It was them that they would give, it's the feminine force that gives birth to the priest kings. So that's gone from today, and that's got to be one of the biggest tragedies, and we got to rebuild those teachings. But the pools and the idea of sacred water is something that I think that we can work with. I think when Atlantis fell, I think one of the saddest things was the loss of these pools and just the loss of the water, all this water that had been like built up and had a certain mineral culture. It had a certain consciousness. It linked to other worlds. You would lay in it and you would remember who you were. You would be in the womb of Sophia. And there were many, many rituals around this, and we can get into this another time. I really want to have a series about, I really want to bring the feminine mysteries back. But I think that a ritual that we can all do from Atlantis is start to work with the bathing in the water. Like now we put salts in our water. We put flowers and we make these like indulgent baths and stuff. And it's like, well, maybe we need to bring back the technology of holy bathing and this idea of blessing water and all of that. I think that's something that we can bring in. Those kinds of natural technologies are going to be the easiest to work with. When you start getting into like some of the technologies in Atlantis that were more material, those more material technologies are, I think, they're not as effective in a lot of ways. And there's definitely different densities to technologies. So I'm definitely going to have to go with, maybe we should bring back sacred bathing. And I think from Atlantis, the high point of Atlantis, remember that there was a Lemurian civilization. And the Lemurian civilization was very connected to, the feminine culture, and it was very matriarchal, and a lot of that feminine wisdom, but also the feminine shadow was really explored in Mu. And so by the time we reached Atlantis, there was actually a pretty evolved feminine culture and feminine class because they'd gone through all of this intense matriarchy. And so there was a bunch of obviously women that were damaged from the matriarchy and men that were damaged, but there was also kind of like this beautiful feminine aspect to Atlantis that was very evolved. And we don't usually hear about that because Atlantis near the end kind of was very influenced by Mars, but yeah, in the earlier phases, we were dealing with the matriarchy, just like we were dealing with Mars. So yeah, so that's it. We're at 3.5 hours. You guys probably want to get up and go pee if you haven't already and whatever. So thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Just because I'm doing this lecture tonight, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be live for you guys on Sunday. Our live Q&A on Sunday will go as scheduled. So that the question forum will open up Saturday around 2 p.m., 24 hours before, and I'll be right here with you on Sunday at 2 p.m. to take your questions. As always, all my love your way, and I will see you in our next stream. you.